Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back, way back, into a part of history that's rarely dusted off in your average museum tour. We're talking the dawn of civilization, long before scrolls or stone tablets, when humans still hunted mammoths cooked over fire, and some bushel still managed to make time for toys. Yes, even in the Stone Age, people were inventing ways to, well, pass the time a little more pleasurably. You're about to hear some things that might shock you, amuse you, or maybe even make you a little uncomfortable. And honestly, that's half the fun. Just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Not the physical journey, of course, but the sheer awkwardness of realizing that prehistoric humans weren't all that different from us. They just had fewer materials and, unfortunately, zero batteries. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing that. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in the late Paleolithic era, somewhere between 28,000 and 10,000 BCE. You're trudging through a damp, grassy valley in what will someday be Germany. The air smells of moss and ash. People around you are wrapped in animal hides, teeth clinking from necklaces, faces soot-smudged and weather-worn. These early humans, your people now, sleep in caves, paint on walls, and carve mysterious objects from bone, stone, and ivory. One such object is about to challenge everything you thought you knew about prehistoric life. Archaeologists call it the Hohle Fels phallus. Sounds fancy, but it's essentially a polished, unmistakably penis-shaped shaft of silt-stone and about 8 inches long and dating back some 28,000 years. Now, was it a tool? Yes. Could it have cracked nuts or flaked flint? Sure, but did it have a secondary purpose? As a personal object of pleasure? Let's just say the groove patterns and smooth finish tell their own story. You can imagine yourself watching one of the tribe's skilled elders working on the piece. He carves it with precision, not just practicality. He polishes it to a gleam that seems, well, excessive, unless it had some more intimate use in mind. Around the firelight, you catch knowing glances exchanged, tiny smirks, the same expressions you'd see when someone today tries not to laugh in a health class video. The object, once finished, is tucked away in a leather pouch and disappears into the privacy of a sleeping alcove. Here's the kicker. Objects like this weren't isolated. Across prehistoric Europe, similar phallic-shaped carvings have been uncovered, some made of ivory, others stone or bone. Some researchers argue they were religious symbols, fertility charms, or even educational tools to explain reproduction. But let's be honest, sometimes a stone penis is just a stone penis. Or maybe not just. Now here's where the fringe theories slide in wearing a tinfoil hat. Some speculate these tools had ceremonial uses tied to female rites of passage or shamanistic fertility rituals. Others, more playfully, claim they were shared among communities. Yes, communal sex toys. No judgment, of course, of course. But one wonders about the sanitation policies of the Upper Paleolithic. And then comes the academic debate. Some scholars push back hard. They argue that labelling these as sex toys imposes modern values on ancient people. After all, maybe these weren't objects of stimulation but of symbolism. Perhaps the phallic shape represented power, creation, or seasonal rebirth. Maybe the entire concept of pleasure was deeply intertwined with survival and spirit, not private enjoyment. But here's a soft whisper of truth. The line between utility, spirituality, and pleasure was probably more fluid than we think. The same object could serve as a hammer by day, a fertility idol during rituals, and, well, something else by night. In a world where survival meant intimacy and reproduction was sacred, pleasure wasn't just indulgence, it was life-affirming magic. You walk deeper into this imagined past, through a cave whose walls flicker with painted bison and horses. Beneath the art, you notice carvings less talked about, spirals, triangles, even crude human forms locked in ambiguous embraces. It's clear that sexuality wasn't hidden or shamed in this world. It was everywhere, etched into stone and bone, whispered through generations. Imagine lying in a fur-lined corner of the cave watching firelight ripple across the ceiling. You're not thinking about Wi-Fi or taxes, you're thinking about warmth, connection, the next meal, and maybe that smooth piece of stone you tucked carefully in your satchel. In that moment, you're as human as anyone today, curious, creative, and searching for ways to feel good in a dangerous, cold world. Now, take a breath. You've just walked through the very roots of human sensuality, raw and rough-edged as a cave painting. There were no batteries, no instruction manuals, just instinct, innovation, and a dash of animal hide. What's wild is how much we still don't understand about these early objects. Were they taboo or treasured? Shared or secret? Worshipped or just used? The only certainty: you're standing at the beginning of something incredibly old, and, weirdly, incredibly familiar. You step further into the past, brushing aside the humid breath of millennia as you duck into a low-slung cave. It smells of mineral dust and fire soot. Somewhere beyond the dark edges, water drips in slow rhythm, echoing like a heartbeat through stone. You're in Chauvet, or maybe Altamira, surrounded by walls daubed in rust-coloured ochre and charcoal, images of buffalo, wild horses, and antelope dancing in firelight like prehistoric cinema. But you look closer. Down in the corners, half hidden or deliberately tucked behind layers of animal motion, you start to spot something else, shapes that aren't animals, shapes that look like people, naked people, doing things, and Paleolithic cave art has long been seen as a visual record of the hunt, rituals for survival. Survival itself, it's etched in red and black. But there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that sex too was part of the early human story these artists were trying to tell. In French caves like Grotte des Combarelles, stick-figure humans appear mid-act, their bodies twisted in suggestive ways. Some show exaggerated breasts, hips, or male anatomy. It's like a prehistoric storyboard of the human experience, minus the Instagram filters and censorship rules. You can almost hear the snickering as the artist worked. Imagine someone carving a very well-endowed stick man, while another keeps watch for saber-toothed tigers. These weren't accidents. The intent is too clear, the detail too deliberate. And while some archaeologists still chalk it up to fertility symbolism, others are starting to admit that, yeah, okay, maybe these folks were just really into drawing what they were thinking about. Now comes the odd part. Some of these drawings aren't even accessible unless you crawl deep into narrow cave chambers. We're talking full-on belly crawl, torch in hand, claustrophobia-triggering corridors. Why go through all that trouble to doodle something if it wasn't meaningful or at least very, very private? That's where the debate sparks up again. Was this secret art for initiates in fertility rites? A kind of early erotic liturgy? Or were these the prehistoric equivalent of scribbling naughty doodles on a bathroom wall? No one knows, but the clues keep coming. In caves from Spain to Indonesia, fertility symbols pop up again and again. Triangles that mimic female anatomy, bulbous lines with uncanny resemblance to male forms, and of course the ever-present Venus figurines, small, round, curvy and proudly nude. We'll talk more about them next, but for now, it's enough to say they belong to this same early mindset, that the human body and what it could do was something worth honouring, or maybe just something worth obsessing over. Fringe theorists, naturally, go wild with all this. Some claim these carvings were made under the influence of psychedelic plants, that shamans entered trances and scrawled cosmic erotica on the walls of their minds and caves. Others suggest they were teaching tools like Stone Age sex ed diagrams. One particularly spicy theory claims that the positioning of some drawings, low to the ground near shadowy corners, suggests they were placed for private viewing, during rituals that involved touch as much as sight. Whether that's sacred ceremony or prehistoric foreplay depends on who you ask. But one fringe idea stands out like a handprint on a cave wall, that these erotic images weren't just for titillation, but for summoning. That maybe, in a time when humans lived and died by fertility, By the success of reproduction, drawing these acts wasn't scandalous, it was sacred. A visual incantation to call forth life, pleasure, continuity. That's heavy, and beautiful if you let it be. Still, scholars argue, some dismiss the erotic readings altogether, insisting that what we see as explicit is just abstract or misinterpreted, or influenced by our own modern biases. That maybe those wide-hipped figures and phallic forms were spiritual, not sensual. But honestly, those two things weren't separate back then, not really. Survival and sex, life and death, pleasure and the divine, they all swirled together in a kind of sacred chaos. The cave, with its echoing chamber and flickering shadows, wasn't just shelter. It was a womb, a holy place, a canvas for everything that mattered. You sit now imagining one of those artists crouched beside you, a shard of stone in hand working by torchlight. They aren't ashamed. They don't giggle. This is important to them. Serious, even. They draw what they know, what they feel, what brings joy, connection, perhaps even power. There's no line between art and life, between desire and devotion. There's just the slow scrape of charcoal against limestone and the knowledge that someone, someday, will see it and understand. And here you are, thousands of years later, trying to make sense of it all, trying to see past the dust and the cracks and the scholarly arguments to what really mattered to these early humans. You realise now that these weren't just pictures, they were acts of communication, emotional blueprints passed down through time, and maybe, just maybe, a few were also dirty jokes scratched into sacred rock. Because why not? Humans have always been complicated like that. Outside the cave, night has fallen. The stars overhead look almost exactly the same as they did when that stick figure couple was first etched into the stone. You feel a strange closeness to those ancient artists. A closeness that's less about what they did and more about why. Curiosity, longing, a need to explore the edges of experience even when survival was the daily grind. You breathe in, the air cool and damp, and wonder how many of these stories we'll never know. How many drawings have crumbled, how many carvings were swept away by time, and yet what remains is enough to tell you. They were here, and they were more like you than you'd ever expect. You're still in the Paleolithic, but the cave has faded behind you, and now you're stepping into a meadow, see you. Soft with grass and buzzing with life. A warm breeze brushes your skin as you follow a worn path that leads to a ring of stones, and nestled in the dirt nearby, small, unassuming, but impossible to miss, is a figurine. Not just any figurine, though. She's about 4 inches tall, carved from limestone with exaggerated breasts, a full belly, broad hips, and no visible face. You're looking at one of the oldest and most hotly debated artifacts in the world, the Venus of Willendorf. Found in 1908 in what is now Austria, this curvy little sculpture dates back over 25,000 years, and from the moment she was unearthed, scholars and spiritualists alike have wrestled over what she meant. Fertility symbol, prehistoric pornography, a self-portrait by a pregnant woman, or something else entirely. You pick her up carefully in your mind's hands, and she's surprisingly heavy for her size, solid, earthy, intimate, like she was meant to be held close. The first thing you notice is how intentional the design is. Her breasts and belly dominate her figure, while her arms rest lightly across her chest. Her face isn't there, at least not in any way we'd recognise. Instead, her head is wrapped in what looks like a woven pattern, like braided hair or a knit cap. That anonymity is part of what makes her so magnetic. She could be anyone. She could be you. Now, in modern museums, she's always displayed upright, standing tall in a glass case. But you wonder if that's how she was actually meant to be seen. Maybe she was laid flat, nestled in a sacred spot, or passed hand to hand in moments of hope or fear. Maybe she wasn't symbolic at all, but literal. A teaching tool, a representation of pregnancy and nourishment, or even a kind of spiritual touchstone for women going through childbirth. Then again, some scholars lean harder into the erotic side. They point out that her form emphasises sexuality in a very blunt, unmistakable way. that her carving wasn't just functional or spiritual, it was sensual. A handheld object, maybe even a companion in moments of loneliness or intimacy. A prehistoric sex toy, not in the mechanical sense, but in the emotional, symbolic, deeply human sense. When the world was brutal and short, maybe holding something that embodied comfort and desire was an act of resistance, or maybe just a little escape. And the Venus of Willendorf isn't alone. There are dozens, possibly hundreds of Venus figurines found across Europe and Asia. From the Venus of Lesbuge with her surreal curves, to the sleek lines of the Venus of Dolny Vestonese, these tiny stone women show up across thousands of years and thousands of miles. Some have incised vulvas, some have traces of red ochre, possibly symbolizing menstruation or fertility. Some were even deliberately broken and left in ceremonial context, suggesting a kind of ritual use, maybe prayers for successful births, or maybe intimate moments of connection with something sacred. Then there's the wild card, the theory that some of these figurines were made by women themselves, using their own bodies as reference. Think about that. A woman thousands of years ago, looking down at her swollen belly and breasts, carving what she sees, herself. The idea turns the whole male gaze narrative on its head. Maybe these weren't made for men at all. Maybe they were made by and for women, as expressions of identity, power, even pleasure. Fringe theories, as always, go further. Some claim the figurines were part of a matriarchal cult that predated written religion. Others argue that they were early goddess icons, predating mythology but still pulsing with spiritual meaning. And then there are the more risque claims that they were used in ritual sex rites, paired with chants, dances, or even rudimentary stimulation. Were they held during acts of love, whispered to in the dark? No one knows for sure, and that mystery is part of what makes them so captivating. Of course, some scholars roll their eyes at all this. They insist that the sex toy angle is modern projection, that these figures were symbolic, not practical. But even within academic circles, there's a growing openness to acknowledging the full spectrum of human experience. After all, prehistoric people weren't robots. They loved, they feared, they dreamed, and yes, they probably had some very human ways of passing a long, cold night. Now, here's something quirky. In 1822, the Venus of Lesbuge was studied by a young Pablo Picasso, who reportedly found her inspiring, and not just artistically. He said she had everything, and it's not hard to see why. These figurines hold a power that transcends time, a strange blend of eroticism, divinity, and raw humanity that's hard to pin down but even harder to ignore. You picture yourself holding one of them now, alone under the stars, perhaps tucked into a makeshift shelter of mammoth bone and hide. Your fingers trace her curves not out of perversion but familiarity. You've seen these shapes in real life. Your partner, your mother, or your own reflection in a pool of water. She isn't fantasy, she's raw. And in that moment you feel less alone. That's the quiet shock of the Venus figurines. Not just that they existed, but that they endured. Through fire, flood, ice, and time. They survived because they mattered. Because someone once tucked them away, carefully, lovingly, maybe even mournfully. Maybe they were meant to be held during birth. Maybe they were cradled during loss. Maybe they were kissed before being hidden beneath a rock. And maybe, just maybe, they were part of the same emotional landscape we still navigate today, the tangled, messy, beautiful, human craving for connection, comfort, and joy. The wind picks up through the grass, whispering across the ancient ground. Somewhere out there, more Venuses lie waiting to be found, to be understood, or misunderstood, which is often just as interesting. You glance once more at the figurine in your palm, and for a moment you swear she winks at you. You shift your footing from the grassy plains of prehistoric Europe to the sun-baked banks of the Nile. It's hotter here, thick with the scent of lotus blossom, clay and slow-moving water. The air hums with flies and prophecy. You're standing at the edge of ancient Egypt. a civilization that practically invented the art of mixing the sacred with the sensual. And tucked away in a protected chamber, half buried in a collapsed tomb, lies something the scholars don't usually talk about on their guided tours, the Turin Erotic Papyrus. This isn't some vague symbolic scroll with flowery language and metaphors about rising sun gods and fertile fields. No, this is full-colour, hand-painted, 3,000-year-old ancient Egyptian porn, and not even the subtle kind. The papyrus, which is over 8 feet long, is a wild, wonderfully exaggerated parade of naked figures in, let's just say, inventive positions. There's humour in it too, which somehow makes it even more shocking. You can imagine the artist giggling as he added in a monkey, playing a lute in the corners, while a priest does something decidedly non-priestly with a serving girl. You can't unsee it, and that's kind of the point. Scholars originally dismissed the papyrus as a joke or a parody. Surely it couldn't be serious art. But over time, opinion shifted. What if it wasn't just for laughs? What if this was someone's fantasy, or a kind of sexual spellwork? Or even ancient erotica sold under the table like a raunchy novella? Suddenly, it isn't so easy to laugh off. You lean closer to the painted figures, their eyes lined in kohl, bodies fluid and exaggerated. And you realise these people had imaginations, big ones, and the toys? Oh yes, there were toys. In Egyptian tombs, archaeologists have uncovered phallic amulets, often worn as protection against evil, but also doubling, perhaps, for more intimate use. The line between spiritual and sensual in ancient Egypt was incredibly blurry. Items like the wand of Hathor, curved and ivory carved, might have been ritual tools for invoking fertility or goddess power, or if you squint a little and think practically, they may have also served more tactile needs. These wands were often found near women's remains, carefully placed, like something meaningful was being sent into the afterlife. There's one particular artifact that turns heads in museum storage rooms, a smooth, polished stone object from around 1200 BCE, shaped unmistakably like a phallus found in a woman's burial site. Scholars first classified it, somewhat optimistically, as a ritual object, but one couldn't help notice that the dimensions, finish, and wear marks tell a different story. There's nothing like a 5,000-year-old euphemism to make a historian sweat. You imagine being there, in the final days of a woman's life, someone respected, perhaps wealthy. Maybe she requested that this particular object accompany her into the next world. Not because it was taboo, but because it was hers, comforting, familiar, a source of strength, even pleasure. The priest wouldn't have blinked. The embalmer would have wrapped it in linen just like any other treasure. In Egyptian culture, pleasure wasn't sin, it was part of life's cycle. Sensuality was linked to the gods, the erotic was divine. Now, if you step back a little and view the broader culture, you see a society saturated in sexual symbolism. From the fertility rituals of Isis to the regenerative myths of Osiris, Egypt treated creation, physical creation, as sacred. The story of Osiris's dismemberment and rebirth centers on a missing penis, reconstructed by Isis with magic. Yes, that's right. One of the oldest resurrection myths involves an enchanted, otherworldly phallus. Talk about a powerful symbol. And here's the fringe twist. Some scholars believe that temple rituals involved physical intimacy, especially in fertility rites. Certain priestesses of Hathor and Bastet, goddesses of love, music and pleasure, were said to engage in sacred sexuality. There are whispers of ritual stimulation, divine embodiment, and even specially shaped implements designed to channel goddess energy through the body. Did they use tools for these rituals? Quite possibly. Wooden, ivory or bronze, crafted with care and symbolic precision. Unfortunately, organic materials don't preserve well, so what survives is only a shadow of what might have existed. Of course, the academic counterpoints come fast. Some claim these interpretations are just modern fantasies imposed on misunderstood relics. Maybe the papyrus was just satire. Maybe the stone objects were symbols of power, not pleasure, but the evidence is tantalizing. And when you place it all in the context of Egyptian daily life, where perfumes, cosmetics, aphrodisiacs, and sensual poetry flowed freely, it's hard not to see a culture that embraced eroticism as just another part of being human. One piece of love poetry found on an ostracon shard from Deir el Medina reads, "My heart flutters hastily when I think of your love. It lets me not act sensibly. It lets me not put on a dress, nor wrap my scarf." It's soft, personal, lustful, and tender. And probably not written for public consumption. Maybe that ostracon was a gift, a confession. Maybe it was tucked under a mattress of palm leaves beside a polished object shaped like devotion. You walk through the rows of papyrus scrolls, sacred statues and perfume jars, and it strikes you. This isn't just history. It's desire fossilized in gold and alabaster. It's people loving, aching, teasing, and touching across the centuries. Even the gods couldn't escape it. Ra had his fiery passions. Hathor seduced and sang, and humanity followed in their footsteps, making, breaking, and crafting tools along the way to meet their most human needs. The Nile murmurs in the distance, and you realize how alive this world still feels, not because of its grandeur, but because of its intimacy. The brush of linen against skin, the weight of a carved stone in a private drawer, a picture scrawled in ink that once made someone laugh or blush. In Egypt, the erotic wasn't hidden. It was drawn, worn, carved, and carried into the afterlife. You turn away from the scroll, the monkey still serenading someone's very complicated evening in ink, and step out into the sun. Somewhere under the sands, more truths sleep. But you know now, those truths won't always be what the textbooks say. Sometimes they're shocking, sometimes sacred, and sometimes strangely both. Now you're walking along white marble steps, the kind that echo under your feet and demand to be admired. The sun is harsher here, bouncing off the beadlings of ancient Athens, and the scent of olive oil, wine, and sea salt clings to the air like a second skin. This is the world of classical Greece, sophisticated, dramatic, loud with debate, and surprisingly obsessed with sex. Not in a whisper behind the curtains way, but in a very public, painted on your pottery kind of way. And if you're thinking these philosophical types were too refined for erotic novelties, think again. Welcome to the golden age of the olisbos. That's right, the Greeks had a name for it. Olisbos, a word for a dildo often made of leather, wood, or even padded fabric. These weren't niche products either. They show up all over Greek literature, pottery, and most notably in jokes. Lots and lots of jokes. You get the sense pretty quickly that the Greeks weren't shy. In fact, they may have invented the art of making philosophical arguments while casually referencing someone's favourite leather pleasure implement. You pass by a bustling agora where merchants shout and philosophers posture, but just off the main square, there's a shop that doesn't get much tourist traffic. It's quieter, more discreet. On the shelves inside, behind woven curtains, sit items that look suspiciously like elongated gourds, polished handles, or soft leather pouches stuffed firm and stitched tight. That's your Athenian version of an adult boutique, and whether used by lonely wives while their husbands were off at war, or by hetaerae, Greece's high-class courtesans, olisboi were common enough that playwrights like Aristophanes joked about them on stage. Loudly, with props. You wander past a red figure vase, and there it is, an image so clear it might as well be a comic strip. A woman stands, grinning, holding what looks like a wine bottle, but, on closer inspection, is definitely not. These scenes aren't subtle. They're erotic, sure, but also comical, playful, often exaggerated. It's not uncommon to see women using olisbos alone or in groups, sometimes with helpful attendants in tow. There's even a scene of a woman with a basket full of them, like she's stocking up for winter. Some of these vases were likely used during symposiums, male-only drinking parties where topics range from politics to sex to poetry, all lubricated with gallons of wine. The idea of women using sex toys might have been titillating for the audience, but it also might have been recognised as practical. After all, The ancient Greek marriage system wasn't exactly built around emotional intimacy. Many women lived cloistered lives, and when their partners were away, at war, at sea, or at a symposium, well, they made do. There's a brilliant passage in the Samia, a Greek play, where a woman refers to an olisbos as part of her daily routine. Not sacred, not shameful, just part of life. The kind of detail that tells you this wasn't hidden. It wasn't scandalous, it was just normal. But the olisbos wasn't the only player in this ancient toolkit. Some fringe theories suggest more complex devices existed, possibly made of bronze or ceramic, even with added features like internal padding or cooling oils. There are records of perfumed olive oil being poured into hollow tubes, supposedly for massage, but the imagination does wander, especially when the descriptions get suspiciously vague. And then there's a fascinating open debate about the Baubo figures, small terracotta sculptures showing a woman lifting her skirts to expose her vulva, sometimes with a smile, sometimes mid-dance. Were these part of the same sexual landscape? Were they talismans for fertility, humour, or protection? Or were they perhaps used during female-centred rituals that included both laughter and sensuality? Some believe Baubo represents the divine feminine in its most unfiltered form, a reminder that even the sacred had a naughty sense of humour. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some scholars insist on separating the spiritual from the sexual. They argue that these images and objects were symbolic, that their presence doesn't prove use. But try telling that to a vase painter who took the time to illustrate every curve, every strapline, every moment of mid-act ecstasy with dramatic flair and a knowing wink. And speaking of symbolism, phallic imagery in Greece was everywhere, not just in bedrooms or art, but in the streets. Literal street signs in the form of erect statues marked brothels. The god Hermes, guardian of travellers and commerce, was often represented by a stone pillar topped with a face and a very prominent, let's call it a vertical pointer. These herms weren't hidden. They stood proudly along roads and in front of homes, offering protection and presumably a chuckle or two. You sit now in a small amphitheatre, watching as a troupe performs an old comedy. On stage, the characters shout about lost lovers and mistaken identities, but there's a subplot involving a woman who's heartbroken not over a man, but over the olisbos she lost during a flood. The audience roars with laughter, not because it's absurd, but because it's relatable. And that's the twist. These items weren't fringe in ancient Greece, they were daily, domestic, woven into the rhythm of city life and romantic frustration. The olisbos wasn't a secret shame, it was a solution. Or maybe just a way to pass the time between sonnets. You lean back, the sunset painting the marble columns in gold, and you can't help but appreciate how open the Greeks were. They didn't hide desire behind curtains or shame it into silence. They joked, carved, painted, and lived with it in full view. Their toys may have been simpler, but their acceptance of pleasure, personal, practical, and humorous, was surprisingly modern. Before you go, you pass one more vase. It's cracked, worn, but still vivid. A woman lounges, serenely smiling, her olisbos tucked under her arm like a loaf of bread. You nod, understanding something timeless in her expression. Some things, simple, private, deeply human, transcend centuries with a smirk. The air gets dustier and heavier as you step forward into a city frozen in time. There's a sudden silence as if even the birds know not to speak too loudly here. You're in Pompeii now, streets of volcanic ash, mosaic floors still clinging to their colour, and walls that remember far more than they let on at first glance. The city died quickly in 79 CE, buried under Mount Vesuvius, but it lived wildly before that. And the deeper you wander through its excavated alleyways, the clearer it becomes. The Romans were not shy, not even close. In fact, they turned sexuality into architecture. You walk into a domus, a Roman townhouse, and your eyes are immediately drawn to the mosaic at the entrance. It's not a floral pattern, it's not a noble crest. It's a phallic symbol. Yes, smiling with wings. Some versions even show it with little legs and a bell around its neck. Welcome to the world of the fascinum, a Roman symbol of luck, protection, and a blatant penis worship. These little winged phalluses show up everywhere, on wind chimes, on pendants worn by children carved into bakery ovens, even hanging from soldiers' necks in battle. For the Romans, the phallus wasn't just a body part. It was a ward against evil and a declaration of life force. And then, of course, there were the brothels. In Pompeii alone, there are at least 25 buildings that might have functioned as lupanaria, or houses of pleasure. The most famous, probably the Lupana of Pompeii, still has its stone beds intact, low platforms with the pillows carved right into the masonry, and above each room, little frescoes showing exactly what kind of fun you could expect inside. These weren't abstract or censored. They were graphic, clear, and surprisingly varied. The Romans were nothing if not imaginative. But let's talk toys, because oh yes, they had them. Among the ash-covered remnants, archaeologists have found polished bronze phallic implements, small ivory objects, and even wearable items that serve dual purposes. Fashion and function, if you will. One such object, now sitting discreetly in a museum drawer, is a bronze item shaped for internal use, designed with finger loops for better grip and control, sleek, utilitarian, and oddly elegant. Some call it a tool of medicine. Others, more convincingly, call it what it clearly appears to be. There's also that curious leather item found near a woman's remains in Herculaneum. Tightly rolled, shaped and padded. Was it a pouch, a scroll case, or something far more intimate? Historians debate, of course, but the woman had it stored in a container alongside combs, makeup and perfume. You connect the dots yourself. Roman literature doesn't shy away from these themes either. Writers like Ovid, Catullus and Martial spilled ink over lust, laughter, and the creative use of cucumbers. Martial especially was brutal with his sexual epigrams, tiny poetic roasts aimed at real people, sometimes including accusations of excessive self-pleasure or scandalous behaviour with household objects. If you ever thought the Romans were stuffy, Martial will disabuse you of that notion in 5 lines or less. And then there's Priapus, the garden god, the original not-safe-for-work deity. His shrines once dotted Roman homes and villas, featuring statues of a man with an absurdly large, permanently erect member. He was meant to ward off thieves, but clearly he was also there to entertain. These shrines sometimes included offerings, fruit, coins, small carved phalluses. One even had a poem attached that warned intruders they'd suffer, well, incredibly personal consequences if they crossed his territory. You picture that now, a thief creeping through a garden at night, only to be scared off by a marble sculpture with an aggressive welcome. Effective in its own way. Some fringe theorists go further, arguing that the Romans created vibrating devices using pulleys, water pressure, or even animal bladders. While hard evidence is lacking, the Romans were skilled engineers. They built aqueducts, heated floors, and rotating theatre stages. Would it really be so far-fetched to imagine a little hydraulic fun? At the very least, there's circumstantial evidence. Writings that mention pulsing objects or stimulators, often given to noblewomen as discreet gifts. Nothing definitively proves their use, but the Romans left just enough clues to make your imagination buzz. There's an academic divide here too. Some insist that labelling these items as sex toys is speculative at best, anachronistic at worst. But when faced with carvings, literature, and household items that look, function, and are referenced like personal pleasure tools, it becomes difficult to draw a clean line between ritual, medicine, and just a good time. You turn down a smaller alley in Pompeii and see another fresco, this one on the wall of a tavern. It's cheerful, almost cartoonish, a man carrying an enormous phallus slung over his shoulder like a wine jug. Below him, a line of smaller figures cheer him on. It's crude, hilarious, and very, very Roman. In a culture where public baths were a social ritual and nude statues filled public squares, sex wasn't just tolerated, it was part of the Roman aesthetic. They didn't hide pleasure, they sculpted it in marble and painted it above their beds. One of the most eye-opening discoveries comes from a private room in a Pompeian villa. The room, tucked discreetly near the atrium, contained shelves with jars of scented oils, silk cloths, and bronze tools whose shapes suggest use far beyond aromatherapy. The arrangement of the space, intimate, clean, tucked away, speaks of ritual, of intellectual, a place not for shame but for pleasure. And if you want the final proof of how comfortable Romans were with sensuality, look no further than the Gabinetto Segreto, the secret cabinet in Naples. This museum collection was formed after Pompeii's discovery and houses all the most explicit finds: frescoes, statues, amulets, and yes, implements. For decades, the cabinet was only open to men of mature age and good morals, which is hilarious considering the objects inside would probably make most modern curators blush. Now, of course, it's open to everyone because history isn't clean, it's messy, cheeky, and full of surprises. You leave Pompeii as the ash settles again in your mind, realizing that what these people left behind wasn't just art or tools, it was evidence of how much they embraced life, including the parts others pretend not to see. And the toys, they weren't hidden in shame, they were used, laughed over, painted onto walls, and carried into the bedroom like any other artifact of pleasure and power. The air shifts again as you travel eastward, trading togas and marble colonnades for the spice-laced warmth of ancient India. It's a land humming with incense smoke, temple bells, and centuries of poetic reverence for the body. Here, sensuality isn't hidden away in dusty corners or painted as a comedic relief. It's revered, studied, practiced like an art. And at the centre of that reverence stands a name you probably recognise, even if only in whispers: the Kama Sutra. Now, let's get one thing out of the way. The Kama Sutra isn't just a dusty sex manual for the adventurous couple looking to spice things up with gravity-defying yoga. It's a serious philosophical text, written around the 3rd century CE by a scholar named Vatsyayana. And while, yes, it does include descriptions of positions that could make a Cirque du Soleil performer break a sweat, most of the text is about relationships, emotional intelligence, aesthetics, etiquette, and the pursuit of pleasure as a legitimate path to personal and spiritual growth. You find yourself seated in a quiet courtyard. Stone walls rise up around you, etched with delicate carvings of lovers in embrace. You're holding a scroll, hand-copied by a monk in a silk robe, ink still fresh. The air smells of sandalwood and rose, and there it is on the page. Not just poetry about passion, but practical guidance, tools, methods, props, lubricants, devices, all calmly discussed without shame. The Kama Sutra doesn't blush. One of the most fascinating sections details how women and men alike could enhance their pleasure using items like polished sticks, soft cylindrical inserts, and even devices made of gold or ivory, shaped to resemble male anatomy, but with added adornments, rings, knobs, curves, designed for maximum effect. These weren't crude, they were crafted, sometimes elaborately, and by artisans trained in the arts of pleasure. Think less cheap trinket and more sensual sculpture. Some even vibrated, yes, really. Using water pressure, pendulums or wind-up mechanisms, Curtin's devices reportedly mimicked movement. It's not a stretch considering Indian engineers of the time were already building complex automata and mechanical toys for royal courts. Then there's the tradition of yoni puja, ritual worship of the vulva, practiced as part of Tantric ceremonies. This wasn't sexual in the modern performative sense, it was spiritual, reverent. The female body was seen as a portal to the divine. Offerings were made, mantras chanted, and sometimes sculpted objects used to invoke Shakti, the feminine cosmic force. Pleasure and the sacred weren't at odds, they were two ends of the same silk thread. You step into a temple, maybe Khajuraho or Konark, and your eyes widen. The carvings on the outer walls are not shy. Figures contort in passion, some solo, some partnered, some in groups, some with expressions of bliss so vivid you'd swear they were alive. There's even one figure mid-reach, grasping what looks very much like a long, polished object, held not with shame but with purpose. These temples weren't secret. They were public, holy, and covered in eroticism. Of course, modern scholars debate the purpose of these carvings. Were they instructional, fertility blessings, or simply artistic celebration of karma, desire, as one of the four pillars of life alongside dharma, duty, artha, prosperity, and moksha, liberation? Some argue the outer walls represented the distractions of the material world, which must be acknowledged and understood before entering the spiritual inner sanctum. Others believe they were part of actual rituals performed by temple dancers or courtesans trained not just in music and poetry, but in sacred sexuality. And yes, those courtesans, known as ganikas, were highly respected. Many were educated, powerful, and well-versed in the use of pleasure tools. Records describe their personal collections, often stored in ornate chests, carved ivory devices, glass phials of perfumed oils, small bells, silk cords, and tiny mirrors. These items weren't scandalous. They were expressions of agency, art, and self-care. There's even evidence, albeit sparse, that some of these items were shared, loaned, or gifted between women, tokens of friendship or perhaps sisterhood in pleasure. The idea of community among women around these tools adds a layer of warmth and subtle rebellion to the narrative. It wasn't just about men's enjoyment. It was about women knowing themselves and enjoying themselves with pride. Now for a fringe theory that always raises eyebrows. Some ancient texts describe magical implements created by sages or tantrikas, imbued with mantras that were said to awaken inner light when used properly. Were these literal tools blessed with chants, metaphors for awakening chakras, or both? The texts are vague, deliberately so. Tantric traditions loved their riddles, especially when it came to sex and spirit. Some believe these magical tools were hidden from colonial eyes and surviving today in private temples or passed down oral traditions. Others think they were destroyed during periods of cultural suppression, particularly under British rule, which whitewashed or outright banned India's erotic legacy. But the debate over these devices, real or metaphorical, is ongoing. Some scholars claim that modern people romanticize the Kama Sutra and Tantric practices, reading too much into ambiguous texts. Others push back, arguing that Western prudishness distorted what was once a vibrant, open-minded, even celebratory culture of sensual wisdom. What can't be denied is the craftsmanship. Whether you're looking at a smooth quartz insert, a gilded bronze stimulator, or a sandalwood pleasure wand wrapped in red silk, these weren't crude objects hidden under mattresses. They were beautiful. Some are even displayed in museums today, just not always with placards that tell the full story. You pause beneath the shade of a banyan tree, a small stone sculpture in your hand. It's smooth, shaped, balanced perfectly for the palm. Whether it was a ritual object, a private toy, or both, it tells you something that words alone can't. These people knew the body, they honoured it. They weren't embarrassed by desire, they studied it, documented it, and made tools to explore it. As dusk falls, you hear temple bells ring in the distance, calling the faithful to evening rituals, but you're already in your own quiet ceremony, standing in the overlap between history and intimacy. In ancient India, that overlap wasn't taboo, it was sacred, divine, and made of ivory. The hum of incense fades as you move further east, across jagged mountains and endless plains, until you reach the cool, mist-softened stillness of ancient China. The air smells like tea leaves and sandalwood. Cicadas buzz in the trees, and silk flutters quietly behind lacquered screens. You're standing now in a garden pavilion, a scroll painting unfurling in your hands. The brushstrokes dance with subtlety, willow branches, moonlight reflected in water, and a pair of figures in a gentle embrace. But if you look closer, tucked behind those flowing sleeves and poetic metaphors, you'll find something altogether more surprising. Welcome to the world of Taoist sexual practices, quiet, coded, and centuries ahead of their time. In ancient China, sex wasn't just for reproduction or indulgence. It was believed to be part of maintaining health, longevity, and cosmic balance. Taoist philosophy saw the body as a system of energies, yin and yang, hot and cool, rising and sinking, and sexual energy Jing was a powerful force that could be harnessed, channeled and even transformed into spiritual enlightenment. Forget Victorian prudishness. In this world, sex was alchemy. You sit beside an aging scholar in his study. He sips tea while explaining without a flicker of discomfort how proper sexual technique could prolong life and increase wisdom. And part of that technique? Tools, a range of intimate implements, many of which were crafted from jade, cold, smooth, and spiritually potent. Jade wasn't just precious, it was believed to draw out toxins, balance energy, and harmonize bodily rhythms. That's why the earliest known pleasure wands from China were carved from this sacred stone. One example, found in a Han Dynasty tomb dated around 200 BCE, was shaped like a gently curving rod with delicate carvings along its base, likely symbolic, possibly practical. It was stored alongside all grooming tools and silken cords, suggesting it belonged to a woman of wealth and status. Whether used for solo pleasure, partner play, or ritual practice, it wasn't hidden. It was honoured, placed in death as a continuation of life. Now here's where things get even more fascinating. Taoist manuals like the Sunu Jing, classic of the Plain Girl, and He Yin Yang, combining yin and yang, go into detail about the use of sexual positions, breathing techniques, and implements for channeling energy during intimacy. These weren't pornographic manuals, they were medical, philosophical, almost as scientific in tone. And within those texts are references to specific tools used to massage inner points, stimulate meridians, and awaken dragon gates. Translation: yes, they are probably talking about sex toys. Some of these devices were designed to be heated or cooled, carved from materials like jade, soapstone, coal or bronze, and kept in temperature-controlled lacquer boxes. One preserved example even had a series of tiny bells along the base, creating a soft musical chime with each movement. Was it for pleasure, for ceremony, or both? The records are poetic but vague, always balancing metaphor with mystery. It's like trying to decode a fortune cookie written by a very wise and extremely discreet adult store owner. Of course, some scholars argue that these references are spiritual, not physical, that the jade stem and golden gate metaphors refer to energy flows, not actual devices. But others counter that Taoist literature was known for layering literal and symbolic meanings, so a reference to the polished moonstone entering the lotus path could just as easily describe a jade implement as a mystical state of mind. And let's not forget silk. Oh yes, silk wasn't just for robes. Ancient texts describe silk cords used for restraint, not in a punitive sense, but for meditative focus. Restraint not as domination, but as control, a way to heighten sensitivity and awareness, a method, not a punishment. Some Taoist lovers even used breathing tools, hollow reeds designed to modulate breath and delay climax, training the body the way a monk might train the mind. These weren't improvisations, they were planned, crafted, and passed down from teacher to disciple like sacred knowledge. You pause in a quiet courtyard where women gather to paint and play music. One holds a long, curved object decorated with etched clouds and dragons. She dips it into a pot of scented oil, not hiding it, not smirking, just caring for it. You get the sense it's more than a toy, it's a companion, a tool for meditation, for health, for connection with self or partner. There's no embarrassment, no dirty giggles, just calm, practiced grace. And then there's the fringe layer, the theory that entire Taoist sects practice sexual rituals involving these tools, not in orgiastic frenzy, but in quiet ceremony. Some believe these rituals involve men and women pairing off under lunar cycles, using specific implements to awaken energy points and synchronize their ki. Whether it's true or just wishful myth-making is still debated. There's little concrete evidence. Most of it is oral lore, smuggled out through later adaptations, often rewritten or suppressed during more conservative dynasties. One legend speaks of Empress Wu Zetian keeping a private collection of jade toys, stored in velvet-lined boxes and cared for by eunuchs who specialised in the arts of relaxation. It may be apocryphal, but it's strangely believable. Wu was powerful, sensual, and unapologetically in charge of her own pleasure. She wouldn't have been the first noblewoman with a secret stash, and certainly not the last. As with so many ancient societies, later cultural shifts attempted to erase or sanitize this history. Confucian values emphasized restraint, modesty, family duty. The idea of personal pleasure, especially for women, became suspect. Artifacts disappeared, manuals were burned. Knowledge that had once been shared openly passed into whispered stories or hidden texts, but the tools themselves still surface, from tombs, from antique shops, from forgotten drawers in palace ruins. You run your fingers over a jade cylinder resting on an embroidered pillow. It's heavier than you expected, cool at first touch but slowly warming in your palm. It's hard to believe something so elegant, so calmly designed was ever a taboo. But that's the strange magic of history. What was once sacred can become scandalous, and then sacred again. As you walk back through a moonlit corridor, wind rustling the bamboo leaves, you realise you've stepped into a different kind of intimacy. Not one of raw passion or laughter, but of peace. Ancient China didn't treat pleasure as something dirty or disposable. They saw it as balance, harmony, something to be shaped in jade and handled with care. The wind shifts again, becoming cooler and salt-tinged as you drift to the islands of Japan. There's a calm here, a hush that rests over everything like a silk robe drawn gently across bare shoulders. You hear the soft clack of Gita sandals on polished wood, the distant rustle of bamboo, and the whisper of a folding screen being slid into place. You're standing in the pleasure quarters of Edo period Japan, home of the ukiyo, the floating world where reality dissolves into music, art, poetry, and yes, eroticism. If ancient China treated sex as sacred alchemy, Japan embraced it as fleeting beauty, delicate, intimate, and tinged with melancholy. And hidden in this world, behind rice paper doors and lacquered drawers, are some of the most stunning and surprisingly practical sex toys ever made. Your first glimpse comes through a piece of shunga, Japanese erotic woodblock prints, often dismissed today as curiosities but once collected by samurai, courtesans, and even monks. One print catches your eye, a woman reclining on a futon, robe loosened, smiling at something in her hands. You look closer. It's an object, slender, lacquered, gently curved. It's unmistakably a toy, and yet it's presented with the same care and artistry as a folding fan or a tea bowl. This was the Japanese approach. Nothing crass, nothing thrown together. Even pleasure was refined. The harigata, the Japanese term for a dildo, appears frequently in shunga, and it was as varied as the culture that made it. Some were carved from wood or bone, smoothed to a shine, sometimes wrapped in silk or covered with soft leather. Others were made of stoneware, shaped like male anatomy but stylized with delicate engravings, waves, cherry blossoms, cranes in flight. You find one in a private lacquer box, nestled beside a sachet of plum-scented oil. It's not hidden in shame, it's part of a ritual. Some harigata were even mechanical. There's a famous example in an Edo museum, a ceramic insert with a pump mechanism that allowed warm water or perfumed oils to flow through it. Think of it as a pre-modern warming device and irrigator in one. Was it for health, for comfort, for pleasure? Probably all three. The Japanese were nothing if not efficient. You visit a high-end brothel in Yoshiwara, the licensed red light district of Edo. Here, courtesans weren't just sex workers, they were cultural icons. Trained in music, dance, calligraphy, and conversation, many also kept personal collections of erotic tools and accessories. Their drawers might contain intricately carved ivory toys, bundles of scented cloth, delicate restraint cords, and ink-stained books of poetry about the thrill of longing. Pleasure wasn't hurried, it was staged, performed, like a tea ceremony with moaning. One particularly famous shunga set by artist Hokusai shows not just couples, but a woman embracing a sea creature, tentacles swirling sensually around her. Yes, that image is both bizarre and oddly moving, a depiction of pleasure that borders on myth. Scholars debate its meaning. Is it fantasy, satire, or symbolic fusion of woman and nature? Fringe theories say it reflects a cultural openness to fluidity in sexual identity and imagination. More grounded takes say it's just really creative erotica. Either way, it shows the Japanese weren't afraid to push the envelope, and apparently didn't care if the envelope was underwater. There's also mention in old pillow books, diaries of noble women filled with poetic musings and quiet scandal, of women crafting their own toys out of wax, shaped and cooled by the moonlight. Some even wrote of cooling these devices in spring water before use, or warming them in the hand lanterns. One noble woman mused, "Better the steady heat of the lantern than the flicker of a lover's promise." Ouch. But relatable. These writings also include references to friendship toys, objects shared between women, often in same-sex relationships or as acts of mutual comfort. These weren't hidden under titles of sin or taboo. While same-sex intimacy wasn't exactly celebrated, it wasn't always criminalised either. Some shrines even quietly welcomed offerings of paired dolls, soft, symbolic representations of feminine closeness. The line between tool, ritual and affection blurred often. One item could be all three. And yes, let's talk about the fringe. One theory claims that some Buddhist sects in medieval Japan used wooden phalluses, sometimes worn, sometimes used ceremonially, to teach about detachment through simulated pleasure. Know the body to transcend it, the monks would say. While most temples probably didn't stock a hidden drawer of erotic gear, certain esoteric practices within Shingon Buddhism did explore body-focused meditation that may have included such tools. There's even a scroll that shows a monk meditating beside a carved object with the inscription, "He touched the body to forget the body." Deep, weird, kind of brilliant. Of course, the scholarly debate swings back around. Was shunga really about sex, or was it just metaphor? Were these devices widely used, or reserved for the elite? Did women in rural villages really own carved toys, or just dream about them from prints? The records are blurry, artifacts are rare, partly because most were made of organic material, partly because shame and war and colonialism swept much of it away. Still, the evidence that survives is enough to sketch a compelling picture. The harigata, the oils, the cords, they weren't accessories to cines, they were accessories to liver. For a culture that revered the fleeting, the fall of a petal, the passing of a season, it makes perfect sense that pleasure was savoured as a brief, bright flame, never crude, always poetic. You step into a bathhouse now, steam rising around you. A woman in a thin robe sits beside her companion, brushing her hair and laughing softly. Beside them, a lacquer box half open reveals not secrets but honesty. The tools they use aren't hidden, they're polished, cared for, part of the story. And when they're done, they'll be washed and returned, not because they're shameful, but because they're precious. As you leave the floating world, lanterns bobbing in the canal and distant music drifting through the night, you realise something. In Japan, pleasure was not only allowed, it was composed, designed, curated like a poem. The toys of this world weren't just functional, or they were beautiful, ephemeral, and yes, sometimes made of jade and silk and perfumed clay, because even a private thrill deserved elegance. You cross another ocean of time, this one thick with tropical air and dense with the pulse of jungle drums. You're in the heart of Mesoamerica now, under a sky the colour of obsidian, and stars sharp as jaguar teeth. The temples of the ancient Maya rise above the treetops like stepped ziggurats, carved with glyphs and gods, watching silently over sacred plazas. There's no mistaking the feeling here. You've entered a world where the cosmos itself is stitched to the human body. And yes, even here, in a civilization best known for its calendars and sacrifice sex, and sex objects played a vibrant, if often overlooked, role. You pass through the courtyards of Palenque or Tikal, stepping softly on ancient stone. Priests and scribes once moved through these same walkways, carrying folded codices and obsidian blades. But there were also artisans, potters, woodworkers, and among their more modest creations, water jugs, incense holders, ceremonial masks, you start to notice shapes. Shapes that curve and suggest carvings not meant for gods or kings, but for something more private, more human. One ceramic piece from the classic period shows a reclining male figure, eyes closed in ecstasy, legs parted, with a clear, unmistakable object held in his hand. A cylinder, polished, decorated with serpents and maize. The glyphs near the base translate loosely to opening the flower or awakening of joy. Not exactly subtle, and not alone. Other figures show dual partners in erotic embrace, not just in two-dimensional relief, but in full three-dimensional pottery, poses rendered with clarity and, honestly, impressive anatomical detail. Scholars at first didn't know what to make of these. Some labelled them fertility objects. Others dismissed them as crude folk art or post-conquest forgeries. But as more surfaced, hidden in tombs, offered in cenotes, or found in private quarters of elite residences, their authenticity became undeniable. The Maya didn't just have sex, they celebrated it, ritualized it, and quite possibly used tools to enhance it. There are obsidian objects, cool and heavy in the hand, polished to a mirror, shine, and shaped with intentional curves. Were they ritual daggers, scrying mirrors, or something altogether more intimate? It depends on who you ask. One particularly compelling piece found in a sealed crypt in Copan was wrapped in woven fibre and tucked among ceremonial jewellery. Its shape is unmistakable, and its placement, tucked near the pelvis of the female skeleton, not randomly tossed in but clearly, deliberately positioned. Here's the kicker. In Mayan cosmology, the body was a microcosm of the universe. Every part of the human form was tied to celestial forces. The mouth was the east, the genitals the centre, the axis mundi. To stimulate the centre was to awaken the world tree within. Pleasure wasn't distraction, it was ritual, and if a smooth obsidian tool could help stir that sacred energy, why wouldn't it be used? But then comes the fringe twist, whispered between archaeologists who aren't quite sure how far to go in their interpretations. Some posit that certain Mayan ceremonies involved couples, or triads, engaging in ritual intercourse enhanced with implements under the guidance of a priest or priestess. The goal? To channel divine energy, merge with deities, or perhaps reenact the sacred union of the maize god and the earth goddess. These rites, they say, weren't common. They were elite, reserved for those trained in the mysteries of the glyphs and the heavens. The supporting evidence is scattered, as it often is, scratched onto codices, hidden in the folds of sculpture, tucked behind metaphors. But one glyph in particular keeps showing up, a coiled serpent entering a flower. Interpret that how you will. The Maya certainly did. Of course, there's debate. Some scholars argue that applying modern ideas of sex toys to ancient cultures distorts their meaning. Maybe these objects weren't for pleasure at all, but for initiation, purification, or symbolic rebirth. Or maybe that's just another way of saying, we're uncomfortable with the idea of ancient people having better sex lives than we expected. Still, the material evidence grows. In Guatemala, a set of clay objects, long, narrow, hollow, was uncovered in a domestic Zemodin site. Alongside pigments and fragrant resins, the site belonged to a midwife based on nearby bone tools and herbal remains. Did she use these items to ease labour pains? To teach young women about their bodies? Or as part of spiritual rites honouring Ixchel, goddess of fertility and moonlight? No one knows, but the questions themselves speak volumes. And the Maya were not alone. Neighbouring cultures, like the Zapotecs and Mixtecs, also left behind erotic ceramics, scenes of women with implements, men with harnessed devices, group acts involving elaborately shaped tools. In Monte Alban, one burial chamber contained a carved stone slab showing two deities exchanging what looks like an elaborately shaped scepter, or depending on your reading, something much more intimate. The carving's title, Gift of Renewal. Interpret accordingly. You sit beneath the kiba tree now, sacred to the Maya, its roots reaching deep into the underworld, its branches stretching toward the stars. In your hands, an object of carved bone rests, decorated with glyphs worn smooth by centuries. You don't need a museum tag to know what it was for, you feel it. You sense the humanity of its maker and its user. Someone once held this, laughed perhaps, or sighed with quiet joy. What's shocking isn't that these tools existed, but how long we've pretended they didn't. How quickly historians labelled them ritual and ceremonial or symbolic when sometimes they were just practical, beloved, maybe even sacred. As the jungle hums around you, alive with night sounds, you realise that for the Maya, sex wasn't separate from the divine, it was the divine. To feel pleasure was to dance with the gods, and if that dance included obsidian tools and carved ceramics, so be it. After all, in a world where even corn had a soul, why wouldn't your favourite toy? The heat changes again, but this time it's dry, earthy and alive with the rhythmic beat of drums echoing across wide plains and forested hills. You've stepped into the heart of Africa, a vast continent with countless cultures, histories and traditions, many of which span back tens of thousands of years. And while Western archaeologists have long been obsessed with pyramids and scrolls, they often missed or ignored the vibrant sensual art and artifact traditions woven into African life. Tonight, you're not here for kings or conquest. You're here to explore the raw, deeply human expression of desire across tribal cultures. And yes, that includes sex toys. Let's start in West Africa, where the Dogon people of Mali have long preserved a tradition of symbolic and literal representations of sexuality. You're standing before a towering wooden statue, elongated, stylized yet unmistakably explicit. The male figure is erect in more ways than one, his anatomy carved with pride and purpose, and it's not just art. These figures are believed to channel fertility, and they are often displayed during ceremonies that celebrate life, planting, marriage and reproduction. But smaller, more private versions of these figures, carved in wood or bone, have been found inside personal huts and female quarters, sometimes wrapped in cloth hidden inside calabashes. Not all of them were statues. Some were curved, polished and designed for personal use. Slide down to Nigeria, where among the Yoruba, carved ivory and soapstone objects were offered to deities like Oshun, goddess of love, beauty and sensuality. These offerings weren't always just symbolic. One surviving piece, held in a private collection, shows a reclining female figure with an object in her hand, aimed downward, smile wide. Scholars once called it a ritual figurine. Others, with less polite restraint, have pointed out its remarkably toy-like realism and size. You hold the idea in your mind that in a time before batteries, pleasure came from craftsmanship and cultural acceptance. In East Africa, among the Swahili coastal communities, oral histories speak of women using carved instruments for preparation before marriage, tools said to enhance comfort, increase knowledge of the body, and build confidence. These weren't secret, shameful things, they were taught, passed from elder to younger. The implements, sometimes made from coral, wood, or hardened resin, were cleaned, oiled, and kept in ornate pouches alongside incense, henna, and gold jewellery. These practices weren't always documented in writing, but they lived in memory, in tradition, in the way a grandmother whispered to her granddaughter the name of the wood that felt smoothest against the skin. Then there's the fringe, and oh boy, it's glorious. Some folklorists believe that entire oral traditions in parts of southern Africa describe not just the use of sex toys, but magical ones. There are tales of talking gourds or singing stones, said to hum when rubbed the right way. Of course, historians tend to roll their eyes here. Most chalk it up to metaphor or spiritual exaggeration. But then again, Africa has never been short on engineers. From the water clocks of ancient Nubia to the lost wax casting of Benin, the idea that someone might have figured out a way to craft an object that vibrated using wind, heat or water isn't entirely far-fetched. The line between real and ritual is always dancing. Let's return to Zimbabwe now, where the great Zimbabwe ruins rise out of stone and story. In a nearby excavation, archaeologists once found a small palm-sized object carved from polished serpentinite, curved, weighted, and stored in a clay pot beside beads, fertility figurines, and a bone comb. The official record? Possibly ceremonial. But the shape, the smooth finish, and its placement in a woman's grave suggest otherwise. And again we see the pattern. Objects treated with reverence, laid to rest beside the dead as if to say this too was part of life. But it wasn't just about women. Some tribes, like the Makonde of Tanzania and Mozambique, carved figures depicting both male and female arousal. These statues, often given as wedding gifts, came in pairs and were meant to encourage openness, trust, and shared pleasure. They sometimes included small detachable elements, miniature tools or insertable pieces, educational, decorative, intimate, all of the above, probably. And here's the thing, these weren't isolated pockets of culture. Across the continent, in places as different as the Sahel and the Cape, we see similar motifs. Carved implements, explicit figurines, objects that blur the lines between spiritual and sensual. Often made from biodegradable materials like leather, softwood or gourds, many of them haven't survived the centuries. But those that have tell stories of people who weren't afraid of desire, who didn't apologise for wanting to know their bodies. Some scholars argue that colonialism erased much of this history. Missionaries and European anthropologists labelled anything sensual as primitive, deviant, or obscene. Museums hid erotic objects in basement storage. Local communities, under pressure to conform, buried or burned their ancestral practices. Oral histories were lost as generations died or adapted to survive. But echoes remain. You hear one now, Sindur, in the rhythm of a song being sung by an old woman under a baobab tree. She's telling a story about a bride and the carved stick she carried with her, how it was blessed with shea oil and left under the moon. The younger women around her listen, laughing, nodding. Some hold fans to their lips, but no one seems embarrassed. The story is old, familiar, sacred in its own way. You begin to understand something deeper here, that these objects weren't just about individual pleasure. They were about community, continuity, identity. They were tools for understanding oneself, honouring fertility, preparing for motherhood, recovering from loss. They were bridges, between body and spirit, between ancestors and descendants. As the drums rise in tempo and the sun sinks lower, you sit on a woven mat beside a leather pouch. Inside is something hand-carved, curved like a smile, warm from the heat of the earth. You don't need a guidebook to know what it was for. You only need to remember that human pleasure is not a modern invention. It's ancient, rooted, and in places like this it was never shameful. It was life. The light dims as you step into a quieter place, not physically, but spiritually. You're now walking into the world of sacred texts, translated scrolls, whispered prayers, and heavily edited histories. Tonight it's time to wander into the realm of the Bible, not just as a religious cornerstone, but as a complicated, ancient artifact with plenty of sensual subtext. And yes, even here, amid all the commandments and covenants, there are moments where the boundaries of pleasure, intimacy, and yes, even possible tools make a surprising appearance. Let's begin, appropriately, with Song of Songs, also known as Song of Solomon. If the only version you heard was in Sunday school, chances are it was heavily abridged. This lyrical poem, tucked deep in the Hebrew Bible, is bursting with erotic imagery. Breasts compared to fawns, thighs to alabaster columns, lips like dripping honey. It's not vague, it's sensual, poetic, and deeply focused on physical love. Some translations even veer into the territory that's hard to explain with a straight face. My beloved put his hand through the latch opening and my heart yearned for him. Okay, sure, a latch opening, totally not a euphemism. Now, of course, the traditional scholars have insisted for centuries that Song of Songs is an allegory, God's love for Israel or Christ's love for the church. And sure, maybe it is, but it's also very clearly the work of someone who knew what a flushed cheek felt like, who understood longing, and who was not afraid to paint the body in rich sensual metaphor. No matter how you frame it, it stands as one of the most erotic texts in any ancient canon, and while it doesn't mention any physical tools directly, it's hard not to imagine what was tucked under the embroidered pillows in those lush descriptions of inner chambers and fragrant gardens. But let's move from poetry to practice. You shift now to the real world behind the biblical stories, to the households and marketplaces of ancient Israel and its neighbours. Archaeologists digging in Bronze and Iron Age sites across the Levant have uncovered a surprising number of small figurine-like artefacts. Most are female forms, bare-breasted, often stylised with wide hips, prominent curves and flat bases. Many are labelled fertility idols, and maybe they were, but some of them, to put it gently, look suspiciously functional. Their shapes are cylindrical, smooth and palm-sized. One scholar noted that several had clear wear marks along the base and edges, as if repeatedly held or used. A few were even found in private dwellings near cooking and sleeping areas, far from the public altars you'd expect if they were just temple objects. The official academic line, uncertain ritual use, which is ancient studies speak for. We don't want to say sex toy, but maybe? And then there's the curious case of Onan. You probably know the phrase spilling his seed, even if you've never read the full chapter. Onan, in the book of Genesis, is commanded to impregnate his deceased brother's widow Tamar. Instead, he withdraws and is struck dead by God for the offence. For centuries, this story has been used to shame everything from masturbation to contraception. But if you read it carefully, and if you understand the context, it's actually about disobedience, not sex itself. Onan's crime isn't pleasure, it's denying his duty under levirate marriage law. This moment became the basis for endless theological hand-wringing, and perhaps even more interesting, it tells us something crucial. Sexual autonomy, particularly over when and how one chose to ejaculate, was already a heated topic. If a man pulling out could spark divine wrath, imagine how a woman's private practices would have been viewed. Which brings us, somewhat nervously, to the open question of whether biblical women had access to any sort of sexual tool. Direct evidence is scant, largely because anything made of wood, leather, or ceramic and small enough to be kept private didn't survive 2,000 years of soil and censorship. But indirect clues, they linger. For instance, the apocryphal Book of Judith describes a widow who uses her beauty to seduce and behead a general. The language is heavy with innuendo. She bathes, perfumes herself, and dresses in fine linens. She brings her own cushions. She controls the pacing. It's not hard to imagine someone like Judith living independently, owning a small object or two that helped her maintain that seductive mystique. In fact, in several later rabbinical commentaries, there are cryptic mentions of women's instruments used during periods of abstinence, described vaguely, but implying both privacy and pleasure. Fringe theorists have latched onto these lines. Some suggest early Hebrew women used polished stone or wooden tools, possibly even as part of ritual cleansing combined with bathing in mikvahs, ritual baths. Others argue these tools were part of older Canaanite traditions that persisted quietly despite monotheistic reformers. These traditions may have included goddess worship, fertility rites, and sacred sensual practices, all of which were systematically stamped out in official religious texts, but remembered in whispered stories, veiled art, and family relics passed down under the radar. One curious archaeological find from the site of Lachish includes a small, smooth cone-shaped object carved from alabaster. No clear religious symbols, no inscription, but its size and polish suggest, use Was it a pestle, a symbolic item, or something else? No one knows for sure, but it fits a pattern seen across ancient cultures, objects that blur the line between sacred and sensual, public and private. Then there's the cultural context. The ancient Near East was not a sexually repressed place. The cultures surrounding ancient Israel, Babylonian, Sumerian, Phoenician, had long histories of temple goddesses associated with sexuality. Some temples included sacred prostitutes. Some myths featured gods and goddesses wielding objects described as rods of power or cups of renewal, phrases so loaded they practically glow. But the Hebrew Bible came from a different current. It was about control, order, separation. Over time, especially after the Babylonian exile, the sexual freedom that may have existed earlier was replaced with laws, taboos, and careful editing, which makes the surviving clues even more tantalizing. The idea that someone, somewhere, still carved a little stone comfort object and tucked it away behind a wall hanging, that they carried it through exile or left it behind in a clay jar, is deeply moving. Defiant even. You kneel now in the corner of a ruined home in ancient Judea. The stone floor is cool beneath your hand. You see faint outlines of shelves, soot on the wall from long ago lamps, and in the far corner, something smooth peeks from beneath broken pottery. You reach for it, heart beating faster, knowing it won't come with a label, but you don't need one. You know what it was, what it meant. In the end, what the Bible doesn't say might be more revealing than what it does. The absence of toys in official scripture doesn't mean they didn't exist, just that they weren't part of the public story. But in the private lives of women, widows, poets and lovers, behind veils and beneath cedar roofs, you better believe something was humming quietly through history. The desert stretches before you now, golden sands rippling like silk under a heavy sun. You're in the cradle of early Arabia, long before minarets and holy texts, before rigid laws and doctrinal lines. This is the pre-Islamic world, a vast landscape of tribal caravans, perfumed markets and poetry that knew no shame. The air is thick with oud and myrrh. Camels groan in the distance, and behind embroidered tents, beneath the stars, a different kind of story was unfolding, one of desire, expression, and yes, pleasure tools tucked quietly into saddlebags and cedar boxes. You find yourself seated on a colourful woven rug beside a crackling fire. Around you are Bedouins, nomadic people whose traditions run deeper than the dunes. One man strums a rabab, the strings humming beneath his fingers. Another recites a poem that starts sweet but turns quickly to something far more intimate. Pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, especially in the Mu'allakat, the celebrated hanging odes, was often soaked in sensual metaphor. Women compared to gazelles, hips like Jaung dunes, and skin like polished ivory. These poems weren't whispered. They were performed in front of audiences, praised for their erotic brilliance, and passed down as family treasures, and embedded within them, sometimes quite literally, were clues. One poem tells of a woman who carries a curved wand of ebony, gifted to her by her mother, to ease the long weeks when her husband rode with the caravan. Another describes a leather-wrapped implement, warmed by coals, kissed by rose oil, brought out only during the new moon. The lines are slippery, layered in metaphor, but they're there, consistent, repeated. Tools, aids, devices, call them what you like, woven into both longing and daily life. And those devices, they weren't imaginary. Among archaeological finds in the southern Arabian Peninsula, places like ancient Sheba, modern-day Yemen, have surfaced small polished objects carved from ivory, alabaster or fine-grained stone. Some are roughly cylindrical, others with a delicate curve and engraved patterns stored in ceramic vessels with lids. One particularly well-preserved piece was found alongside a vial of dried perfume and a bone comb, all part of a woman's personal effects. Scholars originally called them cosmetic tools, but the shape and wear patterns suggest something more private. You imagine her now, a woman alone in her tent, the walls gently swaying with the wind. She's bathed in water brought from the well, her hair wrapped in linen. She opens a cedar box, Inside, her tools, ritual and intimate rest beside frankincense resin and henna. There's no shame in this moment, just ownership, familiarity, the quiet confidence of someone who knows her body. This era, sometimes called the Jahiliyyah, or time of ignorance, is often painted in black and white terms by later scholars, but in truth it was as rich, complex, and full of nuanced gender roles. Women had voices, some led tribes, ran businesses, wrote verse, and some, like Hind bint Utbah or Layla al-Akiyaliya, became legendary for their outspokenness and sensual poetry. They spoke of touch, of longing, of nights that lingered too long without company. If these women were brave enough to speak of desire in front of kings, it's not much of a leap to imagine they also knew how to care for themselves in its absence. A fringe theory suggests that caravans carried more than just spices and silks. They may have transported handcrafted intimacy tools as well. Traders moving between Yemen, Ethiopia and the Levant would have had access to materials like ivory, ebony and soft stone, ideal for sculpting. Some historians argue that women's tools were likely hidden in bundles of cosmetics and oils, unlisted in cargo inventories but always requested by regular clients. Was there an ancient market for personal pleasure items, nestled quietly between coal jars and perfume bottles? Quite possibly. And let's not overlook the Nabateans, the mysterious desert people who built Petra, carving temples into cliffs. Their art includes sensual motifs, especially in small figurines that show couples embracing or women in poses of pleasure. Some of these figurines have removable parts. One, displayed in a Jordanian museum, includes a tiny detachable rod hidden inside the base of the sculpture. It's been labelled ritual tool, but again, we see the same evasive phrasing, the same refusal to call a toy. The scholarly debate here is fierce. Conservative historians insist that pre-Islamic Arabia, while poetic, was not as permissive as modern readers might wish. But others argue that sensual expression was not only tolerated but celebrated, so long as it was cloaked in the right symbols. And in a culture where metaphor was currency, cloaking came naturally. And then came the shift. With the rise of Islam in the 7th century, sensual expression became more regulated, but not erased. Early Islamic texts are, perhaps surprisingly, quite open about marital intimacy. Manuals from later centuries like the Perfumed Garden and the Encyclopedia of Pleasure detail positions, aphrodisiacs, and even instructions for crafting pleasure tools. But the openness of the pre-Islamic period, its earthy, unfiltered sensuality, gave way to something more structured. Still, the legacy lingered. The poems, the objects, the rituals, they didn't vanish. They simply went underground. You find yourself in a tent again, now quieter, lit only by the flicker of oil lamps. An elder woman sits beside a girl, brushing her hair and murmuring a story. It's not about angels or prophets. It's about Layla, who once kept a secret gourd, carved from the soft belly of a date palm wrapped in red silk and used only during rainstorms. The girl giggles, but she listens. The knowledge is passed on not through books, but through breath. And now you're holding such an object in your hand. Not gilded, not elaborate, just warm, smooth wood, worn soft from years of care. You understand that this isn't a relic, it's a companion. And while the world around it changed, conquest, scripture, reform, this piece of carved comfort remained the same. Pleasure, here in the ancient Arabian world, was not always public, but it was ever present. Humming under poetry, hidden in pouches, whispered across generations, and sometimes, in the quiet hush between verses, it was simply fizzed. A chill clings to the air now as you cross the threshold into medieval Europe. The world feels tighter here, the sky greyer, the structures more rigid, cathedrals looming like stone judges, abbeys cloaked in silence, and the smell of smoke and damp wool hanging in narrow streets. This is a time of whispered sins and loud sermons, of cloistered bodies and watchful eyes. But even under the weight of religious doctrine, sexual desire didn't vanish. It just learned to hide. And if you're picturing chastity belts and locked doors, You're not entirely wrong, but not entirely right either. Let's start peeling back the layers. You're in a convent garden now, watching nuns prune lavender as bells toll in the distance. Their heads are bowed, their habits neat, but one of them hums a tune, low, sweet, just a little off-colour. Later in the scriptorium you notice her pause too long over an illuminated manuscript. The image she's copying, a marginalia doodle of a nun straddling a strange rod-shaped object. It has tassels. It might be a broom, so it is probably not. Welcome to the strange, repressed but really not world of medieval eroticism. Let's start with the infamous chastity belt. You've heard of it. A metal contraption allegedly used to keep women pure while their husbands were off crusading. Locked, bolted, with a tiny key. A kind of pelvic prison, but here's the twist. Most actual chastity belts in museums, fakes, 19th century inventions. Victorian fantasies about how depraved the Middle Ages must have been. The first recorded mention of a chastity belt doesn't appear until centuries after the medieval period. So were they real? Maybe in rare ceremonial contexts as theatrical warnings or symbolic threats, but the idea that they were widespread? Not likely. So if women weren't locked in iron bloomers, what were they doing? The answer, at least for some, is experimenting with more discrete forms of autonomy. Among the surviving texts from medieval Europe are medical manuals and household guides that describe massage implements for female hysteria. That's the polite way of saying they knew, however vaguely, that certain physical stimulations had calming effects. Some midwives were trained to administer this therapy, and some, according to a few barely censored letters, recommended self-treatment. Wooden phallic objects have been discovered in wells and beneath floorboards, often along with combs, rosaries and amulets. Were they ritual items? Possibly. But some are so obviously shaped, so well polished and so discreet, you'd need a pretty thick veil of denial to call them anything but pleasure devices. But the real treasures lie in the art and marginalia, the little flourishes monks added to manuscripts while their minds wandered from scripture. Among the rabbits jousting and nuns milking dragons are unmistakably erotic images. Women fondling themselves with phallic vegetables, clerics in compromising positions with demons, and yes, objects that look like medieval dildos wearing tiny hats. These weren't jokes written for schoolboys. They were inked by grown men in monasteries, and while they may have been satire, they also reveal what people were imagining and laughing about in private. Then there's the case of the double-headed dildo, a wooden implement carved in two directions found during renovations of a 14th century nunnery in Germany. Scholars tried calling it a baton of prayer or ceremonial rod, but the wear pattern, curvature and protective cloth wrap told another story. Someone used it. Probably more than one someone. Possibly together. You let your imagination tiptoe there, just for a second, and then tuck it away like they once did. Some scholars argue that these items weren't for pleasure but for medical application, tied to beliefs about womb movement and blocked humours. But let's be honest. In an age when sexuality was so controlled, it's no surprise that the language of medicine became a backdoor to intimacy. "It's for health," said the housewife with a carved wooden insert hidden under the mattress. Sure it was. There's also a peculiar medical text called the Trotula, a medieval guide to women's health written by a female physician, or possibly a group of them, in Salerno. It describes in careful Latin tools used for female examination and stimulation. Not for fun, of course, never that. But again, the descriptions are just vague enough, the materials just gentle enough, wood, cloth, herbal salves, that the line between wellness and want gets blurry. And the fringe? Well, brace yourself. Some believe there were underground networks of women, midwives, herbalists, nuns, and widows, who shared knowledge, recipes, and tools. That these women passed down not only healing traditions, but intimate ones. That a carved ivory object found beneath a convent chapel, its handle shaped like a lily, wasn't just a reliquary or a candle mould. That when the Inquisition came sniffing, more than a few sacred-looking artefacts were hastily buried, burned, or misfiled as devotional. The backlash to all this came hard. As church control tightened, especially in the late medieval period, anything resembling female sexual autonomy was painted as witchcraft. If a woman knew how to find pleasure, she must have made a pact with the devil. If she owned a carved stick wrapped in linen and scented with lavender, it couldn't be for her own comfort, it had to be evil. And so one by one the tools vanished, or more precisely were hidden, under floorboards, inside hollow statues, behind veils of silence. But silence doesn't mean absence. You stand now in a crumbling manor, its tapestries long faded, its drawers creaking open to reveal dust and lace. And under a pile of prayer cards and dried flowers, your hand brushes something smooth. It's only a sliver of what once was, wood worn down the edge of a carved tip. It's enough. Enough to know that behind all the sermons and saints, someone once took the time to carve a moment of joy, to hold it, to use it, to keep it close. In medieval Europe, sex didn't stop, it went underground, into coded texts, whispered rituals and objects misnamed for centuries. But now, slowly but surely, their real names are returning, not with judgment, but with recognition. The stone walls of a monastery rise before you now, their surfaces cold and bare, like the intentions of those who built them. The year is somewhere in the 1200s, give or take. You're deep in the Christian Middle Ages, and everything feels hushed, eyes lowered, sins confessed, bodies cloaked in wool and obedience. This is the church's heyday, and its long shadow stretches into every corner of the Western world. Lust is a cardinal sin. Pleasure, especially unsanctioned and unsupervised, is suspect. And yet, humans remain humans. Desires burn low in the belly even beneath the heaviest of robes. And where there is repression, there is rebellion, or at least creative concealment. You walk through a stone corridor lit by flickering tallow candles. A monk passes by, nose deep in a manuscript, his brow furrowed with a devotion that's part prayer, part exhaustion. But what's inside those thick manuscripts isn't always what you'd expect. As you thumb through one, past psalms and sermons, you find a sketch in the margin, barely visible in the dim light. It's a nun, holding something long, something unmistakably phallic. She's smiling, not meekly, not sinfully, just amused. It wasn't unusual. In fact, these marginalia, tiny drawings scribbled into the edges of holy books, offer some of the most direct evidence of medieval curiosity about sex and pleasure. And while the church's official stance was aggressive condemnation, these Bardnett sketches, alongside certain artifacts, whisper a different story, that people were finding ways to bypass the rules, sometimes literally under the noses of priests and inquisitors. By the 13th century, the church was actively compiling lists of sins for confession, detailed ones, guides for confessors with questions that often revealed far more than they concealed. One manual instructs priests to ask, "Has she employed any device or object with an unnatural intention?" You have to wonder, was that a question born from observation or from imagination? Either way, it confirms a truth. The church knew. They knew people were using things, and so they hunted them. Midwives were the first to fall under suspicion. These women, often deeply trusted in their communities, held knowledge of herbs, of anatomy, of birth and pleasure. Some carried small tools used during labour, or perhaps, when requested, for something else. Wooden dilators smoothing stones, herbal oils applied with fingers or carved sticks. To a woman in need of relief, these were kindnesses. To the church, they were potential gateways to sin. And then there were the heretics. Groups like the Cathars in southern France or the Béguiners of the Low Countries practiced forms of Christianity that were more egalitarian, more mystical, and less obsessed with sexual control. These communities allowed women to speak, to lead, and sometimes to explore their own spiritual intimacy in private. When the Inquisition came for them, it wasn't just theology that they were trying to erase, it was independence. Among the ruins of a Cathar stronghold, a small curved object was found beneath the hearthstone. burnt but intact, carved from olive wood, rounded at both ends, and wrapped in a strip of blackened cloth, too long to be a spoon, too short to be a staff. It bore the faint char of fire, like someone had tried to destroy it quickly. The church's official reports called it a blasphemous tool of fleshly indulgence, but whoever hid it probably called it something gentler, something warmer. The fringe theory here? That hidden enclaves of women preserved not just spiritual practices, but erotic tools, passing them down in secrecy, wrapped in scripture, cloaked in devotion. Some believe certain female saints had coded stories, where visions and piercings of the heart were metaphors for something much more corporeal. St. Teresa's ecstasy, famously described as being pierced by an angel's flaming spear, has long-raised eyebrows. The language is unmistakably sensual. Was it spiritual metaphor? Certainly. But could it also reflect a kind of private, embodied joy? You step now into a noblewoman's chamber, less austere but no less watchful. The fire crackles in the hearth. Embroidered pillows spill across a low-set bed. In a cedar chest tucked discreetly behind a tapestry, you find a pouch of personal items, a silver comb, a worn rosary, a tiny flask of rose oil, and something else. Carved bone polished to a shine, shaped with a curve and a flared end. Decorative yet functional. A doctor might call it a vaginal dilator. A confessor might call it temptation. But the woman who owned it, she might have called it hers. Even in royal courts, those paragons of piety, letters and records hint at private pleasures. Catherine de' Medici was rumoured to own carved ivory figures for personal prayer demon. Queen Isabella of Castile, fierce as she was, had her rooms searched during a scandal involving her ladies-in-waiting and certain engraved implements. Nothing was proven, but the rumours stuck. Of course, the official record rarely says sex toy. It says tool as object, instrument, anything to avoid naming the thing itself, but the shapes speak louder than the text. And the frequency with which they appear, unearthed in cellars, hidden in walls, buried beneath churches, tells you everything you need to know. These objects were used carefully, quietly, and in defiance of a world determined to lock desire behind stone walls. Even the materials say something. Metal was rare, too loud, too cold. Wood, bone, wax, and smooth stones were more common. Wrapped in cloth, kept in warming straws beside coals, these items were designed for softness, silence, discretion. They weren't luxury items for show, they were comfort, sanctuary, a rare space where the body could breathe. You sit now in a cloister garden, the evening mist wrapping around you. Somewhere behind you, a sister chants vespers, but before you in your lap lies a piece of history that no one ever wrote down. A shape carved with care, hidden, survived, and now remembered. The church may have claimed dominion over the flesh, but in pockets of silence, behind locked doors and beneath altar cloths, the body remembered itself. Women remembered themselves, and even under threat of fire or exile, they kept small things close, little rebellions carved in wood and wrapped in linen. The wind sharpens now, tinged with salt and snow as you step aboard a longship cutting through icy northern waters. Thick fur cloaks and bearded laughter echo off wooden planks soaked with sea spray and mead. You've arrived in Viking territory, Scandinavia, shut around the 9th or 10th century, and if you think this brutal, seafaring world was too rugged for private pleasures, you'd be mistaken. These people weren't just raiders and traders, they were storytellers, craftspeople, mystics, and yes, even erotic innovators. In fact, the Norse knew exactly what to do when the long winter nights stretched endlessly on. You walk now through a Norse longhouse, warm with firelight, thick with the scent of peat smoke and roasted meat. Men and women sit side by side, their status more balanced than you might expect. Viking women could inherit land, run farms, even divorce their husbands, and the Phoebe were known to take matters of the heart and body into their own hands, literally. Among the beads and brooches, the hand-spun wool and iron tools, archaeologists have found something small, smooth, and suspiciously shaped. Carved phallic objects made from wood, antler, and stone. Some are clearly charms, meant to hang from belts or be buried with the dead. Others, well, they fit rather nicely in a hand. Or elsewhere, one such object, pulled from a Viking-era well in Denmark, is about 6 inches long, polished smooth, carved with runes. Its shape is unambiguous. The runes don't spell out a prayer or a battle cry. They read simply, for pleasure. That's it. No divine excuse, no fertility metaphor, just a blunt little love letter to self-care in the age of axes. But the Norse didn't stop at carving phallic figures. Their mythology is famously rich in gender fluidity, sensual trickery, and sacred sexuality. Loki, the trickster god, regularly changed gender, at one point transforming into a mare, mating with a stallion, and giving birth to an 8-legged horse. The boundary between male and female, body and spirit, was porous. Pleasure wasn't limited to one form or one function. It was part of the shape-shifting chaos that made life interesting. In the poetic Edda, Odin himself speaks of gaining knowledge through cedar, a form of magic often associated with women, and considered shameful for men because it required a surrendering of power, a kind of sensual submission. Scholars believe cedar may have involved ecstatic states, physical touch, and possibly tools, wands, staffs, and carved rods, used not only for spiritual ritual but also for sensual alignment. One staff found in a grave on the Isle of Man, long described as a sorceress's wand, is shaped almost too conveniently to pass as innocent. It was placed beside a woman thought to have been a vulva, a Norse seeress. The burial was rich, silver, beads, a comb, and the wand was wrapped in wool, tucked near her pelvis. Functional or symbolic, maybe both. There's also a poetic passage in the saga of the people of Laxedal where a woman mocks a man for being unable to satisfy his wife, suggesting she take the goat horn instead. Scholars have debated for years what this goat horn is. Some argue it's just an insult, but others point out that the actual horn-shaped objects, carved and hollowed, have been found in female graves, usually near personal effects. Coincidence? Or a sly nod to personal invention? Fringe theorists have taken these finds even further. Some claim that Viking women forged their own toys from carved driftwood, storing them in fur-lined pouches hung from belt loops. One dramatic theory suggests that among the Valkyries, those mythical battle maidens who chose the slain, there existed erotic rituals involving special carved objects, used to initiate young warriors into adulthood before battle. There's zero hard evidence, of course, but the image persists. Strength and sensuality braided together like a warrior's hair. Critics argue that most of these artifacts are misinterpreted, that the phallic amulets were merely charms, fertility tokens, or even jokes. After all, Norse humour was notoriously crude. Runes scrawled on swords and doorposts sometimes just said things like, "Thor was here," or "nice balls." But then again, if you're making penis jokes in runes, that tells us something too, that sexuality wasn't shameful, it was acknowledged, even enjoyed, and this openness extended into art. Carved stones from the Viking period often feature figures engaged in various acts of fertility and passion, sometimes exaggerated to comical levels, but always front and centre. A famous stone from Gotland shows a man with an enormous phallus seated beside a woman holding what appears to be a cup, or perhaps, if you squint, a carved object of her own. Scholars have long scratched their heads over these scenes, but the consensus is building. The Vikings liked their sex graphic and sometimes accessorized. You visit a chieftain's grave now, nestled beneath a low burial mound. His grave goods include a sword, a drinking horn, and beside them, a carved object wrapped in deerskin. It's phallic, yes, but not crude. Smooth, elegant, designed to be held and used with care. Whether it belonged to him or a companion, it was laid to rest with significance. Maybe it was a charm, maybe it was something else entirely. But someone thought it mattered enough to bury beside him. The Norse also had a remarkable tolerance for same-sex desire. Male lovers are mentioned in the sagas, and female companionships, sambud, were sometimes described as life partnerships, even if the church later worked hard to erase those bonds. In this more fluid social fabric, it's not hard to imagine that pleasure tools were shared, gifted, even crafted with affection. A carved bone toy from Sweden, decorated with 2 entwined wolves, was found in a woman's grave beside the remains of another woman. They were buried together. No one can say for sure who they were to each other, but the item between them speaks louder than any rune. As night falls over the fjord, you sit in a quiet longhouse, the hearth casting flickering shadows against the beams. A young woman reaches into a fur-lined chest and pulls out an object wrapped in linen and laughter. It's not hidden in shame. It's something she made herself, or received from her mother, or carved while waiting for her lover to return from the sea. Practical, personal, powerful. The Vikings may have built ships and stormed empires, but they also carved softer things, objects that stayed behind when the warriors were gone. And in those shapes, still smooth after 1,000 winters, you see not just tools, but truths that even in a world of axes and gods, someone who are aware took the time to make pleasure by hand. The wind calms now, and with it, the world softens. You find yourself on an island shrouded in mist and pine, a place where mountains meet rice paddies and temple bells echo across hidden valleys. Welcome to medieval Japan, but not the urban pleasure quarters this time. No, tonight you're stepping into the quiet halls of Buddhist monasteries, where monks chant sutras and sweep stone paths with straw brooms. Here, everything is discipline and reflection, except sometimes it isn't. Because even behind the shoji screens of these sacred spaces, human nature hums softly in the background. And when it comes to the private lives of monks, especially those tucked away in isolated temples, history offers up some unexpected and surprisingly tactile hints. You begin with a story. A humble monk living in a remote mountain temple writes in his journal about temptation. Not some grand moral failing, just the ache of being alone. He describes waking in the night with his thoughts wandering, his breath short, his body restless. And then, almost casually, he writes of a carved object, smoothed from camphor wood, shaped like the firmness of memory, which he uses to calm the restless mind. The journal, discovered centuries later behind a loose wall panel, is delicate with age but startling in its candour. And it's not unique. Other monastic records, particularly in Japan's Heian and Kamakura periods, contain cryptic references to practice objects, stillness tools, and meditative weights. The descriptions are vague enough to slip under censors' eyes, but the context? The way they're stored, referenced, or passed down from elder to novice suggests these weren't just abstract metaphors. You're in a temple storeroom now, carefully lit by a single paper lantern. You open a small wooden box labelled with kanji for private teaching. Inside is a silk-wrapped bundle. Unfold it, and there lies a polished, bone-coloured object, curved, palm-length with soft ridges along one end, not ornamental, not a relic, and not something likely used for prayer beads. Scholars who've examined similar finds from monastic storage rooms, often discovered during renovations or preservation efforts, hesitate to categorise them. Officially they're listed as unclassified ceremonial tools, but the unspoken translation is clear. Then there's the poetry. Oh, the poetry. Japanese monks often kept zuhitsu, freeform essays blending philosophy, observations, and secret thoughts. One such monk, Ryokan, writes of the lonely curve of pinewood against thigh, and how even a man of vows may feel the shape of longing rise with the moon. Whether he meant it literally or poetically doesn't really matter. It reveals a mind that understood the body's quiet insistence. Fringe theories go further. Some researchers argue that entire subcultures within Japanese monastic life quietly accepted sexual self-soothing, not as sin, but as manageable human behaviour. In these interpretations, the use of objects wasn't indulgence, but control. A monk might carve his own tool out of respect for the body, not rebellion. After all, Japanese Buddhism often emphasized balance, not brutal repression. The body wasn't evil, it was a vessel, and even vessels need maintenance. One temple near Kyoto, abandoned during the Meiji Restoration, held a surprising discovery when archaeologists began excavations in the 1970s. Beneath a collapsed library wall, they found a cache of personal items, scrolls, inkstones, a broken statue, and tucked neatly among them, a set of wooden implements, polished, cylindrical, delicately etched with lotus petals. No religious function could be determined, and while the official report listed them as ritual objects, private notes from the lead conservator hinted at their likely use. The surface texture, one note reads, is consistent with frequent contact. One bears faint traces of aromatic oil. And these tools weren't limited to male monastics. There are records, shaky, fragmented, and often dismissed, of bhikkhuni, or Buddhist nuns, who practiced similar disciplines in female-only temples. One 13th century diary belonging to a nun named Aisho references a shonin's gift, which he describes as a shape of stillness, carved from ivory, warmed between cloths, held in silence. Whether this was a meditation aid or something more personal, the language pulses with quiet intimacy. Japanese scholars are divided. Some insist these passages are metaphorical, representations of discipline, or even coded expressions of loneliness. But others, particularly more recent feminist historians, argue that denying the physical realities of monastic life is itself a kind of historical revision. If monks and nuns were celibate, they still had bodies, and bodies don't stop needing just because you wear robes. And what about the implements themselves? They weren't always elaborate. Some were little more than curved sticks, polished smooth with rice oil. Others were more refined: jade, lacquered wood, even ceramics glazed in muted earth tones. Most were modest, functional, easy to hide, easy to burn. One particularly haunting find comes from a temple outside Nara, where renovations uncovered a hollow statue of Kannon, the bodhisattva of compassion. Inside the base, wrapped in linen and dried lotus petals, was a single item, a wooden tool, slightly curved, engraved with the phrase "for stillness and the storm." It had no other there markings, no explanation, just that. Of course, as Japan entered the Edo period and Buddhist institutions became more rigid, more state-controlled, these objects disappeared from records. The surviving ones were hidden, buried, or destroyed, especially as temple reforms sought to sanitize the past. But if you listen carefully, the objects left behind still speak. Not loudly, but with the softness of things once handled with care. You sit now on a tatami mat, the moonlight casting silver bars across the paper screen. In your lap rests a small box. It contains nothing miraculous. Just a gently used tool, perhaps forgotten by time, but once used with intention. Not indulgence, not shame, just human need, answered quietly. In this world of robes and rituals, of tea bowls and incense, the line between devotion and desire was thinner than we've been told. And in those private spaces, under sleeping mats, behind scroll racks, inside hollow statues, lay objects shaped not only for pleasure, but for peace. The road winds now, stretching like a thread across continents, from the bamboo forests of China to the marble streets of Rome, from the misted mountains of Japan to the hot bazaars of Baghdad. You're travelling the Silk Road, not the romanticised tourist version, but the real artery of ancient exchange, where merchants traded spices and silks, yes, but also stories, technologies, philosophies, and sometimes the very tools of private pleasure. Tonight, you're tracing the sensual contraband that slipped between caravan crates, tucked under saddle blankets, or stashed in gilded chests, headed for faraway courts. The Silk Road wasn't just for wealth, it was for desire. And what moved along it would shock the priests and scribes who tried to write those desires out of history. Picture yourself at a desert caravanserai, halfway between Samarkand and Kashgar. A fire crackles low, merchants share dates, wine, and gossip in half a dozen languages. In one tent, a trader from India unwraps a lacquered box and shows off its contents, a curved ivory object inlaid with tiny rubies, shaped with a familiarity that needs no translation. A merchant from Persia nods and smiles knowingly. He's seen its like before, only his version was made of polished obsidian, and came with scented oil pressed from rose petals. Objects like these were rarely advertised, but they moved, quietly, deliberately across borders. The Chinese had their jade stimulators, often packaged with herbal texts. The Indians had ivory and sandalwood tools tied to Ayurvedic practice. The Greeks and Romans too, Hamnidas, contributed their olisbos, some of which were made of leather and wrapped around wooden cores. So what happened when these cultures collided in the trading posts of Central Asia? They shared, they adapted, and sometimes they combined. One silk scroll recovered from a cave in Dunhuang describes an item gifted from a Persian woman of healing hands to a Chinese noble lady. The item, referred to as a jade rose staff, is said to be cool in morning, warm in hand, stirring in the centre, never needing words. Scholars argue about whether this is metaphor or merchandise, but accompanying it is a hand-drawn sketch. You don't need a doctorate to figure out what it is, and it wasn't just objects that travelled, it was knowledge. Arabic medical texts, often based on Greek and Indian foundations, describe tools used to calm the nervous womb, many of which resemble earlier pleasure implements. These books were translated into Latin in Toledo and Salerno, where European physicians nervously tiptoed around terms like cylindrical therapy aid. The descriptions match: rounded tips, flexible shafts, infused with oils. In some texts, they are described as necessary for women suffering from melancholy, especially widows. Because obviously, pleasure couldn't just be pleasure, it had to be medicine. But even under all the euphemisms, the trail is there. In Persia, during the Sasanian era, glass phallic objects have been found in elite women's graves. Their shapes are deliberate and unlike anything used for pouring, cooking, or perfume. They're hollow, sometimes filled with dried herbs or bees, possibly for scent or sound. Some even had removable corks. A merchant's ledger from the period includes a coded entry, 3 glass stems with interior scent for women's private chambers. What were those chambers like? Well, you step into one now, soft cushions line the floors, silk curtains ripple in the breeze. On a low table rests a chest, inlaid with the mother of pearl. Inside, tools of adornment, coal, perfume, combs, and tucked underneath, wrapped in purple cloth, an object shaped for the self. It doesn't bear a cross or crescent, no symbol for man or woman, just craftsmanship, utility, a moment stolen from a life otherwise ruled by duty. The Silk Road wasn't just east to west, it was circular, rhythmic, itices and goods flowed back and forth, adapting along the way. A bronze tool designed in India might reappear in Byzantium with jade reinforcements. A leather-bound stimulator from Alexandria could be copied in Damascus and sold in Venice. These weren't mass-produced items. They were custom, intimate, often built by artisans who catered to those in the know. If you had coin and discretion, you could find what you needed. Fringe theories love this part. Some claim there were entire underground markets devoted to pleasure tools along the Silk Road. Secret shops in caravan towns run by widows or outcasts, where the shelves were filled not with grain or ink, but with objects carved from bone and shell. One such place, allegedly in Nishapur, was described in a traveller's diary as the shop of 7 sighs, where women left lighter than they entered. No archaeology has confirmed it, but oral histories among local families still tell of a market stall that sold women's handles alongside love charms and opium. Meanwhile, Europe pretended nothing was happening, but objects told the truth. In Venice, trade records mention hollow rods from the east, taxed as luxury imports, though their listed use was household. In Istanbul, a 15th century physician's notebook includes a drawing of an implement labelled Indian Remedy, shaped like a spiraled shell with a hollow centre. The note beneath it: to be used when blood does not flow. A nice way of saying when passion needs to be coaxed, and through it all the languages changed, but the hands did not. A woman in Xi'an held the same object style that another in Aleppo used. The tool carved from wood in Lahore might look very familiar to one moulded in Naples. It wasn't plagiarism, it was survival. A quiet chain of women, mothers, midwives, lovers, and artisans, passing knowledge along the spice-scented air of trade. You sit now beside a well in Bukhara. The night is warm, the stars thick above. A merchant rolls out a small mat and unwraps his wares. Among the silks and coins is an object he doesn't speak of unless asked. A piece of smooth quartz shaped by hand stored in a cloth bag. He doesn't sell many, but he sells them carefully. The Silk Road moved more than goods. It moved people. It moved ideas. It moved secrets. And in every hidden drawer, between every bundle of brocade and tin of saffron, someone tucked a little piece of pleasure, quietly carried across the miles. Because even when you travel the world, the need for comfort, for connection, for control of your own body travels with you. You step now into a world that's pulling itself out of shadows. The air feels brighter, the streets wider, the minds not quite freer, but at least more curious. You're in the Renaissance, Italy, maybe France. The year is somewhere in the 1500s, and after centuries of whispered desire and sacred silence, things are beginning to loosen. Not completely, not openly, but enough. Enough for artists to paint nude bodies with reverence instead of shame. Enough for anatomists to sketch vulvas and penises in detailed cross-sections. Enough for sex, and yes, sex tools, to crawl their way out from beneath dusty floorboards and into the private chambers of noble women, midwives and scholars with a taste for the forbidden. Let's begin in Florence. You're in a villa, sun-drenched and filled with marble nudes that pretend they're only about mythology. A courtesan, educated, confident, brilliant, sits at her writing desk. Her ink-stained fingers trace the lines of a letter from a wealthy client. He has sent her a gift, not jewellery, not perfume. It's a device, silver, inlaid with mother of pearl, cylindrical, gently curved, with a detachable base that rattles softly when moved. You might call it proto-steampunk. She calls it delizia mechanica, mechanical delight. That might sound fanciful, but consider the context. Renaissance Italy was a place where invention and indulgence danced together. Leonardo da Vinci himself sketched elaborate gears, pumps, and levers. One of his anatomical drawings, tucked discreetly in a private folio, features what appears to be a cross-section of a female pelvis, with an odd tubular object inserted. It's been labelled as anatomical tool, but Da Vinci, for all his genius, wasn't exactly known for clinical restraint. He was fascinated by motion, by function, by beauty, and where those things intersected, well, let's just say it wasn't always rated for public viewing. At the same time, female anatomy was being explored, not just in medical textbooks, but in secret. A midwife's manual from Venice, written under a pseudonym, describes a smooth wooden tube used for calming the uterus, heated with oil and often held within for several breaths. You don't have to squint very hard to see the truth. And those tools, they weren't rough, they were crafted, turned on lathes, lacquered, sanded. One museum in Bologna holds a set of Renaissance diagnostic rods, each slightly different in shape and diameter. Officially, they were to measure pelvic width. Unofficially, use your imagination. Meanwhile, in France, the salons of the wealthy were hosting salacious evenings, gatherings where poetry and anatomy met. Women wore silk gowns with nothing underneath, men read from Ovid, and in some circles, elaborate education boxes were passed around. These were wooden cases filled with miniature sculptures, lovers in embrace, bodies mid-act, and, yes, tiny replicas of objects used for stimulation. The kits were sometimes medical, sometimes instructional, but always deeply, deeply knowing. And what of the tools themselves? Renaissance sex toys were elegant, handcrafted. Materials ranged from carved ivory to polished cherry wood, from brass and copper tubes to soft leather sheaths lined with lamb's wool. Some included hollow chambers to be filled with warm oil or fragrant herbs. Others had intricate clasps or mechanical features, tiny springs or tension bands designed to create pressure or movement. These weren't mass-produced, they were bespoke, commissioned in secret, made by artisans who specialised in more than door hinges. Fringe theorists go wild here. Some claim Da Vinci, or someone in his circle, actually designed an early vibrator powered by a small water wheel and used in bathhouses for therapeutic relief. There's no surviving blueprint, but one letter from a noblewoman to her physician speaks of a pulsing wand with warm strength, gifted by a most clever friend of Florence. Who else could that be? Some even believe a few of these devices made their way into convents, disguised as medical instruments for treating wandering womb syndrome. Whether fact or fantasy, the rumours point to a real truth. People were inventing for pleasure, quietly but deliberately. And it wasn't all mechanical. Herbalists in the Renaissance were also in on the game. They created aphrodisiac oils, blends of cinnamon, clove, yarrow and myrrh that doubled as lubricants and stimulants. One apothecary text from Lyon includes a recipe for warming balm, meant to be applied to places where breath cannot reach, to coax the rose into bloom. Subtle? Barely, but it hints at the widespread if coded acknowledgement of personal pleasure. There's also evidence that some noblewomen kept their own collections. One estate inventory, taken after the death of a Milanese duchess, lists a lacquered case containing personal tools and devices, which included a bronze rod inlaid with enamel, and 2 silken sleeves within a structure. The archivist labelled the chest articuli ignoti, items of unknown use. But we know better, don't we? The academic community remains divided, of course. Some claim these findings are overinterpreted, that we're projecting modern ideas onto historical objects. But more and more, scholars are acknowledging what was always hidden in plain sight. People in the Renaissance were clever, resourceful, and deeply curious about the body. And they had the means, the tools, the minds, the materials to explore that curiosity. You're in a workshop now. The scent of sawdust and melted wax fills the air. A craftsman turns a small object on a lathe, sanding its surface smooth, testing its balance in his palm. He isn't embarrassed. He's focused. This isn't a toy. It's a commission. A solution. A gift. When he's finished, he'll wrap it in velvet and seal it with wax. It will be delivered in a locked box to a lady whose name no one will speak. And yet, here it is, still surviving, still whispering. Because for all the religious oversight and social restraint, the Renaissance was a time of rediscovery, of lost texts, of ancient freedoms, of the self, and nestled among the pages of newly translated manuscripts and freshly painted ceilings were tools of pleasure, elegant, clever, and absolutely real. You sit now in the corner of a candlelit library. In your hands, a velvet pouch. Inside, a smooth, cool object. Ivory, hand-carved, private. You hold it not with shame, but with awe. This, too, is the Renaissance. Not just art and architecture, but the revival of a quieter human truth, that even in a world of high collars and choral masses, someone always remembered what it meant to feel. The scent changes as you descend marble steps into steam and candlelight. Now you're in the domed warmth of an Ottoman hammam, a bathhouse where bodies shimmer beneath domes pierced with sunlight and steam curls through the air like incense smoke. You've stepped into the heart of the Ottoman Empire at its height, Istanbul in the 16th or 17th century, where the markets bustle with silk and spice, where minarets pierce the sky, and where the sensual lives of women, especially those in the upper classes and harem circles, are quietly thriving behind carved wooden screens. The public world of the Ottoman Empire was bound by religion, law and hierarchy, but within the haremlik, the women's quarters of elite homes or palaces, there existed a rich interior world, full of poetry, music, private rituals, and yes, objects of pleasure that would make a few scholars faint delicately into their manuscripts. You sit now in a tiled chamber, the floors warm beneath your feet, the air dense with rosewater and citrus. A woman leans back against a marble basin while an attendant gently pours hot water over her. Steam fogs the air. Nearby, a lacquered box rests on a low stool, its brass inlay glowing. Inside, a carefully wrapped object, smooth, cylindrical, carved from scented wood. It glistens faintly, either from oil or the condensation of the bath. This isn't a spa trinket. It's functional and well loved. These were the pleasure tools of the Ottoman elite. Often called tashlar, stones, or gizli eşyalar, secret things, they were carved from a range of materials: olive wood, marble, alabaster, and occasionally imported ivory. Most were sized to be easily hidden in drawers or chests, and many were given as wedding gifts or passed from mother to daughter in hushed, giggling conversations. Some were even sent between lovers, wrapped in embroidered cloth with poetry stitched on the hem, and that poetry, erotic poetry, thrived in the Ottoman court. The works of poets like Nedim and Fazl still burn with an essential energy centuries later. Love letters between women in harems often overflowed with longing, metaphor, and thinly veiled references to shared intimacy. Some referenced objects, a delicate stem that quivered with warmth, or a slippery serpent of ivory that knew my name. These weren't just flowery phrases, they were code, and everyone in that world knew how to read it. One preserved love poem from the Topkapi archives includes the line, "Your gift lies beneath my pillow, shaped of sweet wood, cool in the evening, warm with my longing." Scholars danced around the obvious for decades, calling it an allegory for the beloved's absence. But the footnotes tell another story. A few brave researchers now argue it was an open acknowledgement of a physical gift, possibly a tash shaped and given in secret. And yes, we have the objects themselves. Several are stored in private museum collections in Turkey, catalogued cautiously under personal items, female adornments, or simply miscellaneous. But they're clearly insertables, some curved, some textured, a few with silver filigree at the base. One includes a hidden compartment for rose oil. Another is capped with a silk-wrapped handle. These weren't clumsy or crude, they were beautiful, made with intention, care, and no small amount of pride. Some even had religious inscriptions, soft Arabic script along the side reading Bismillah or Al-Hub min Allah, love is from God. The inclusion of these phrases has sparked fierce debate. Were they sacrilegious, or were they an acknowledgement that pleasure, even sexual pleasure, could exist within divine creation? The more mystical branches of Islam, like Sufism, embrace the idea that physical ecstasy could mirror divine ecstasy, and in private, it seems some women, and their lovers, took that message seriously. Fringe theorists suggest that some Ottoman physicians and midwives were behind the creation of specialized tools for womb relaxation and emotional balance. One 17th century medical text, written in Persian and translated into Ottoman Turkish, describes a tool carved to enter and open the seat of sadness, recommending it for women suffering from melancholy, a condition associated with sexual frustration. The same text goes on to describe a balm of mint and clove to be applied with the instrument until the body weeps and the soul stills. Then there are the bathhouses, the hammams, where women often visited in groups, lounging for hours, chatting, laughing, and according to some sources, sharing more than gossip. Travellers' diaries from the 18th century, particularly those of scandalised European diplomats, often hinted at unusual devices used by the women during bathing, though they were too prudish to describe them clearly. But Ottoman records show that hammam attendants, known as nata, sometimes provided assistance with circulation, relaxation, and warming the body through massage with specialised tools that were made of wood, curved, polished, not strictly medical. In the royal harem of Topkapi Palace, it's said that eunuchs and senior women kept comfort chests for the sultan's favoured concubines. These chests contained oils, perfumes, silks, and, according to one steward's notebook, instruments for feminine ease, shaped from stone and warmed before use. Whether these were gifts or grooming tools is still debated, but the phrasing feminine ease is a masterclass in euphemism. Critics, of course, argue that the Ottoman world was too modest, too devout, too restrained for such practices, but the existence of these objects and the text surrounding them say otherwise. Pleasure wasn't denied, it was simply tucked into the folds of poetry, steamed into bathhouse air, hidden inside silk drawers with the rest of life's necessities. You leave the bathhouse now, your skin warm, the scent of jasmine trailing behind. You walk through a garden of fig trees and cypress, and you pause by a fountain, watching the water rise and fall in gentle arcs. In your hand, a small pouch. Inside, a stone object smooth and weighty, engraved with a single tulip. You imagine the hands that once held it, the laughter, the quiet, the sois. In the Ottoman world, pleasure was rarely spoken aloud, but it was always present, carved, warmed, shared, a reminder that even within the strictest of walls, the body always finds a way to remember itself. A crackle of electricity flickers faintly in the distance as the world pivots again. Gaslight replaces candles, corsets cinch a little tighter, and powdered wigs give way to powdered foreheads damp with the fever of inquiry. You're in the Enlightenment now, 19th century Europe, where rational thought rules the day, science steps out of the shadows, and every salon conversation starts with, "Have you read?" The human body is being dissected in public lectures, mapped in meticulous anatomical charts, and pondered in philosophical treatises. And beneath all that curiosity, something unexpected begins to hum to life, literally. This is the age when sex toys start to tinker. Let's start in London, where Georgian doctors, increasingly alarmed by women's complaints of nervous disorders and mourned hysteric fits, begin to offer a medical solution. The condition was vague: loss of appetite, sudden weeping, irritability, fainting, or what one physician called an unsettled womb. The cure: pelvic massage, by hand, administered by a trained professional. It's not until a century later that someone will admit how incredibly awkwardly sexual that all was. But even now, in the 1700s, doctors are realizing just how successful this treatment can be. Here's where things get weird and wonderfully mechanical, because some physicians grow tired, literally. Performing daily pelvic massages to dozens of patients is exhausting, so inventive minds begin developing devices to assist in treatment. Early prototypes appear, crank-powered, piston-like contraptions with padded ends, hidden behind a curtain while the doctor turns the handle from the other side. You imagine the scenario, madness in its clinical denial. But the game changer comes with electricity. Primitive as it is, it's thrilling. In Paris, doctors begin experimenting with mild electrical currents to stimulate muscles. Before long, someone wonders aloud, could the same stimulation work elsewhere? Enter the first electromechanical stimulators, devices with soft leads and gentle pulses, labelled as tools for female hysteria and muscular dormancy. They are advertised in medical journals, they are demonstrated in respectable clinics, and they are used enthusiastically. One 1792 advertisement in a French medical catalogue lists La lumière du corps féminin, the light of the female body, a device shaped suspiciously like a handheld lamp, with a vibrating tip powered by a tiny wind-up coil. It was marketed as a tool to align the female humours and return heat to neglected regions. You could buy one for about the cost of a nice hat. It came with an instruction scroll delicately illustrated. No one called it a sex toy. Everyone knew it was. And it wasn't just in medicine. Behind closed doors, in the private chambers of Enlightenment thinkers, objects of pleasure took on more sophisticated forms. Ladies in powdered wigs and embroidered gowns kept lacquered cases filled with silk fans, rouge, and tucked in a velvet corner, a small glass object curved just so. Some were engraved with initials, others with the quotes from love letters. These weren't shameful, they were romantic, intellectual. French courtesans, known for their wit as much as their wiles, often had their tools custom-made by Parisian artisans. One memoir describes a pearl-handled stimulator, carved in the likeness of a favoured duke, gifted by a baroness to her companion as a going-away present. Thoughtful? You visit a salon in Vienna. The conversation is brisk, Rousseau, Voltaire, the limits of human reason. But in a curtained alcove, a lady of the court demonstrates a new device for relaxation. It looks like a brass telescope but operates with an internal spring. When wound, it pulses softly. She holds it against her wrist as a joke, but everyone knows that's not where she's meant to use it. Fringe scholars suggest that some of these devices found their way into Enlightenment curiosity cabinets. Those eclectic displays of exotic trinkets, bones, insects, and anatomical oddities collected by nobles and scientists alike. In one surviving cabinet from Prague, there's a polished ivory rod with a leather-wrapped handle. The attached note, written in Latin, reads, "For the easing of female restlessness." Positioned next to a narwhal tusk and a dissected bat, it was part of a larger narrative, understanding the world, one trembling nerve at a time. And what about the gentlemen? They weren't left out. A surprising number of personal journals from this era, especially among the more libertine aristocracy, mention devices used in solo pleasure. Some were hollow cylinders lined with soft material. Others were adjustable, allowing for various experiments. One British nobleman recorded in his diary a leather-bound apparatus imported from Italy to be used in bathings and which he claimed produced a most delightful confusion of senses. He wrote that in 1765, decades before the Victorians pretended they'd invented desire. Doctors, ever helpful, began marketing these devices to married couples as therapeutic marital aids. The wording was always coded. To increase connection, to reduce restlessness, to balance energies. But everyone knew what they meant. A German physician's 1781 case study even describes a couple who used a shared device to mutual satisfaction, with no ill effect upon the nerves. Quite the endorsement. It wasn't all romance and science, though. The Enlightenment also birthed its own anxieties. As people studied the body with increasing scrutiny, some grew afraid. Books were published warning against overuse of stimulation, claiming it drained vitality and ruined the mind. One pamphlet declared that too much self-pleasure would lead to a withering of the limbs and the corruption of the soul. These texts were mostly ignored, but they still hummed beneath the surface, sowing seeds that would blossom into full-blown repression in the Victorian age. But for now, in the glowing candlelight of salons, clinics, and boudoir, invention and indulgence walk hand in hand. The tools themselves become more than just implements. They are symbols of a shifting world, where the mind can question, where the body can respond, where the self can be explored quietly, with a spring-loaded device tucked into a leather pouch. You sit now in a high-back chair in a candle-lit study. On the table before you is a velvet-lined box. You open it slowly. Inside, a brass cylinder, a glass tube, a tiny crank, and a hand-drawn diagram labelled simply La Vérité, the truth. Because in this age of enlightenment, the truth was this, that pleasure could be studied, sculpted, even mechanized, and that somewhere in the whir of gears and the curve of invention, the body was learning to speak again with a soft electric hum. The lamps dim, the skirts swell, and suddenly everything is velvet, lace, and layers that never seem to end. You're in the thick of the 19th century now, the Victorian era, that monument to restraint, decorum, and the desperate pretense that no one anywhere had a body beneath their clothes. On the surface, everything is tightly laced. Morality, posture, even furniture is designed to keep everyone stiff and upright. But if you think this period buried human pleasure under moral panic and anti-masturbation pamphlets, think again. Because behind all that repression, there was a thriving, secretive, shockingly inventive underworld of sex toys. And this time, they weren't even pretending to be medical tools. Well, okay, some still were, but the line was getting blurrier by the minute. Let's begin in London, where you enter the office of a nerve sprawlist, tucked discreetly between a tea shop and a corset boutique. The waiting room is tidy. The patients, mostly women, sit fanning themselves, avoiding eye contact. When their names are called, they disappear behind a curtain and emerge 10 minutes later looking oddly flushed and calm. The treatment? Something called the electromechanical pelvic manipulator, powered by steam crank or, later, actual electricity. It buzzes, it pulses, and it's sold as a cure for hysteria, melancholy, or congestion of the womb. The physician, not a pervert of course, just a fan of science. One of the first patented vibrators, the tremoussoir, appeared in France around 1869. It was a table-sized monstrosity powered by a foot pedal. Imagine a butter churn crossed with a jackhammer, topped with soft leather pads. It made its way into clinics under the guise of improving circulation, but by the 1880s it had shrunk to handheld devices, nickel-plated beauties with rubber attachments and names like the Vibro Energizer, Vibratile Cure, and Chattanooga Manipulator. None of these labels are subtle. None of them needed to be. Doctors didn't talk about orgasms, they talked about hysterical paroxysms, and everyone just nodded. But that was the respectable version. In private, things were much more interesting. Let's peek into a Victorian boudoir. Thick drapes, a chaise lounge, a faint scent of violets and talcum. In a drawer beneath a false bottom, a wooden box velvet-lined, containing a collection of objects not listed on any shipping manifest. One is carved from ivory, ridged along its shaft. Another is made of polished rosewood, with a hand crank and internal gearing that creates a subtle rhythmic vibration. And a third, a silver cylinder, hollow, designed to hold warming water, essentially a heated dildo, Victorian style. No one was mailing these through the post. You had to know someone who knew someone, or have a very discreet housemaid. These items were often sold under euphemisms. Ladies' health massagers, personal nerve toners, marital aids. One London catalogue from 1883 lists an adjustable device for nocturnal restlessness, illustrated with a careful drawing of what is clearly unmistakably a phallus in brass casing. Another, from New York, features a product called the Home Exciter, advertised with a demure image of a woman reclining in a rocking chair. The ad claims it relieves circulatory tension and spiritual fatigue. The price? $2 with discreet packaging. And yes, there's documentation. The British Library and the Smithsonian both hold copies of early device patents that describe reciprocating internal motion mechanisms, or vibratory therapeutic applicators. In the margins, handwritten notes by inventors offer alternative uses, can be fitted with curved attachments for female clients, one reads. Another includes an improvement in gripping handles to ensure steady application without external assistance. The winks are so blatant they may as well have included a cartoon of Queen Victoria blushing behind a fan. Fringe theorists have latched onto the idea that entire underground communities, especially among the wealthy, existed for the purpose of collecting and sharing these tools. Some believe aristocratic women formed informal salons where new devices were demonstrated and discussed, often under the guise of health lectures or female wellness nights. Diaries from the period hint at such gatherings, including one entry from a baroness in Bath who wrote, "Lady S brought her contraption again. Miss W refused to try it until the second port, but then took 3 turns and could not speak for an hour." And we can't talk Victorian sex toys without talking about the rise of mail-order catalogues and the American connection. As the US industrialized, a flood of consumer goods, many of them questionably labelled, became available to the general public. Vibrators and insertables were tucked between pages of corsets and hairbrushes. The Sears Roebuck catalogue famously listed personal massagers well into the early 1900s, and while they never said exactly what those were for, let's just say they weren't buying them for sore shoulders. Meanwhile, anti-masturbation hysteria raged. Devices like the anti-onanism belt and youth training beds were sold to keep people from touching themselves. Some even included tiny alarms that would ring if a person's hands moved under the covers. But for every shaming device, there was someone crafting the opposite. Toys became quieter, smaller, more private. Silk sleeves, ceramic bulbs, hand-pumped air pressure stimulators. The ingenuity was impressive. Women weren't the only ones exploring. Men's tools existed too, though they were usually framed in even more ridiculous language. Seminal control tools, virility regulators. A popular item in Germany, the manly strength cylinder, was essentially a masturbatory sleeve with adjustable tightness. Shipped in a plain wooden box. One customer review in a private letter preserved in a personal archive reads, "Most invigorating, recommended during business trips." The debate among historians remains intense. Some say the popularity of these devices was overblown, rare, hidden, elite only. Others argue they were quietly common, passed from sister to sister, advertised between the lines. After all, if we believed every 19th century woman suffered from hysteria, then clearly something was getting the job done. You now find yourself in a dressing room thick with perfume and muffled footsteps in the hall. You open a drawer and run your fingers along polished mahogany. Inside, a device gently curved with a winding key on one side. It whirs when turned. It hums in the palm. A tag stitched to its velvet pouch reads only, "For moments of ladylike distress." In an era obsessed with denying the body, people found new, elaborate ways to speak its language anyway, through gears, coils, levers, heat, and invention. The toys of the Victorian era weren't just secret, they were stunning, symbols of resistance hidden in plain sight, buzzing quietly beneath the weight of all that lace. The engine hums to life beneath your feet as the 20th century roars in like a train with no brakes. Steel, smoke, electricity, telephones, radios, everything moves faster, louder and bolder. And nestled inside this great mechanical leap forward is something else, revving up quietly in bedrooms and back rooms, the personal, increasingly unashamed pursuit of sexual pleasure. That's right, sex toys are entering the modern age. No more carved ivory cloaked in euphemism, no more foot-pedal medical instruments pretending to soothe a lady's nerves. We're heading into the golden age of industrialized desire, where rubber meets electricity, and marketing finally finds the courage to drop the winks and just sell the damn thing. Let's start with a name you may not expect, Hamilton Beach. Yep, the kitchen appliance company. In 1902, they patented a small handheld electric motor, designed for everything from mixing batters to vibrating for relaxation. Within 5 years, enterprising manufacturers figured out that if you attached a padded bulb to it, you had a whole new category of appliance, the electric vibrator. These early models looked like hand drills, weighed nearly 10 pounds, and came with an instruction manual that never once said the word orgasm. Instead, it spoke of relief, circulatory health, and female vitality. Still, the illustrations told a very different story. By the 1920s, vibrators were being advertised in mainstream magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping. Posing confidently next to electric irons and sewing machines, these devices were billed as tools to improve sleep, tone the nerves, and keep a woman cheerful and alert. No. One ad for the White Cross vibrator claimed it soothes, refreshes, and invigorates the tired woman's body, along with a picture of a rather flushed lady reclining in her parlour chair, eyes closed in bliss. Sure, she could have just had a nice cup of tea, but you know better. Meanwhile, the materials evolved. Rubber manufacturing boomed, and with it came flexible, water-resistant toys that didn't splinter or overheat. Enter the modern dildo. Companies in Germany and Japan started producing smooth, curved devices made from vulcanized rubber, often in vibrant reds and pinks. Some were realistic, others looked like space-age gadgets. One Japanese model from the 1930s was called Aino Kagaku, the science of love, and came with interchangeable tips, an adjustable power dial, and a cloth carrying case. Functional, portable, fabulous. But not everyone was thrilled. As these devices became easier to find and buy, governments began cracking down. In the United States, the Comstock laws, named after moral crusader Anthony Comstock, prohibited the mailing of obscene materials, which conveniently included anything related to birth control, erotica, or sex toys. So, distributors got creative. Vibrators became face massagers. Dildos were called novelty sculptures. A rubber sleeve that clearly resembled a masturbatory aid was sold as a thermal stress reliever. No one was fooled, especially not the postal inspectors. The sex-positive underground responded with grit and glamour. In bohemian circles of Paris, Berlin and New York, artists and writers openly embraced sexual freedom, and with it, tools of pleasure. Anais Nin wrote about using a vibrator while thinking of her lovers. Surrealist painter Leonor Fini reportedly kept an array of silver-plated toys in her studio, both for personal use and as muses. And in Weimar, Berlin, a cabaret star named Anita Berber famously performed with a red velvet pouch strapped to her thigh, which she would open mid-act to reveal an ornate ivory dildo. The crowd predictably went wild. Then came the war years, and things got complicated. Manufacturing pivoted to bombs and bullets, and suddenly there were fewer resources for rubber novelties. Still, ingenuity persisted. Soldiers and nurses on both sides of the front reportedly crafted makeshift toys from whatever was available. Wood, plastic tubing, leather, even salvaged airplane parts. One recovered American GI diary includes a sketch of a field massager, fashioned from a medical inhaler pump and canteen strap. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. After World War II, the world changed. Fast. Women had entered the workforce. Contraception was on the horizon, and a cultural reckoning about sexuality loomed just around the corner. Enter the post-war housewife, and the discreet vibrators sold door-to-door under the guise of personal health devices. Avon and Fuller brush salesmen, yes, even them, sometimes carried electro-massage tools hidden behind lipstick samples. The language was always coded. The intentions, not so much. In the 1960s, the lid officially blew off. The sexual revolution kicked in with the pills, protests, and pages of cosmopolitan articles that no longer tiptoed around the word orgasm. Betty Dodson, artist and activist, became a major figure in the open, unapologetic embrace of self-pleasure. Her workshops encouraged women to explore their bodies using mirrors and vibrators, especially the newly available Hitachi Magic Wand, originally marketed as a general-purpose massager. With its loud motor and iconic white and blue handle, the Magic Wand became a legend. Betty used it in demonstrations, recommended it done to thousands, and wrote about it in her 1974 book, Liberating Masturbation, Quiet No More. Fringe theorists love this decade. Some claim the CIA attempted to co-opt the growing vibrator movement for psychological experimentation. Others believe early adult film studios funded the development of stronger, quieter models. There's even a rumour that a prototype of the rabbit vibrator, complete with rotating beads and clitoral extension, was invented by a Japanese engineer who originally worked on submarine sonar. Is it true? Probably not, but do we want it to be? Absolutely. By the 1980s, sex toys had become a multi-million-dollar industry. Mail-order catalogues shifted from coy to confident. Sex shops popped up in urban centres, silicone replaced latex, batteries got smaller, and the designs, sleeker, more playful, and tailored not just for function, but for style. You weren't just buying something to use in the dark, you were buying a statement, maybe even a conversation piece depending on your dinner guests. And all this happened while the moral panic clung on. Religious groups protested, court cases erupted, and even in the 1990s, laws still banned the sale of sex toys in places like Alabama and Texas. But like everything else in history, the underground kept thriving. People shared tips in zines, swapped gear at house parties, and kept carving out joy in a world still reluctant to say its name. You sit now in a bedroom lit by lava lamp glow and the hum of something tucked under a pillow. In your hands, a vintage magic wand, wrapped in decades of rumour and cultural revolution. It's heavy, loud, perfect. You turn it on and feel the vibration, steadily unapologetic, alive, because in the 20th century pleasure went electric, and from there was no going back. You walk now beneath museum lights, the sterile kind that hum overhead, casting cold white glow over marble busts and ancient armour. But tonight you're not here for swords or scrolls. You're here for what isn't on display, for the locked rooms, the sealed drawers, the so-called secret cabinets where curators stash the objects they're not quite ready to explain. Because while museums love their statues of Venus and their mosaics of Bacchus mid-orgy, they've never quite known what to do with the very real, very tangible tools of ancient pleasure. Sex toys, real ones, have been collected, catalogued, and quietly hidden for centuries. Welcome to the Forbidden Archive. You begin in Naples, at the Museo Archeologico Nazionale, where the Gabinetto Segreto, or secret cabinet, holds the most notorious collection of erotic artifacts in the Western world. These aren't just paintings or frescoes, these are physical items, phallic amulets, carved stone dildos, bronze figurines in wild positions with accessories that were definitely not just props. For years, this collection was kept under lock and key, viewable only by men of mature mind and age, a phrase that might as well read "no ladies, no laughing." One item, often described in whispers, is a Roman olisbos carved from marble, polished to a high shine, about 10 inches long and unmistakable in form. Its surface is worn smooth from handling, but not by time, by use. It was found in the remains of a private bathhouse in Pompeii, tucked behind a panel wall. Not symbolic, not decorative, functional. And yet it was catalogued for decades not as a sex toy, but as a ceremonial object. That's the curatorial code phrase of the century. If something looks too explicit to be explained, just call it ceremonial. A bowl shaped like breasts? Ceremonial. A sculpture with detachable phalluses? Ceremonial. A 3-foot-long ceramic penis with a spout at the end? Absolutely, deeply ceremonial. Another cabinet in the British Museum, officially not labelled at all, has drawers that open only when researchers request access through a senior curator. Inside, objects from ancient Greece, Mesopotamia and Egypt, many of which have never been publicly displayed. One is a double-ended ivory piece reportedly unearthed near an Egyptian temple with wear patterns that suggest prolonged contact. Yet in the museum's records, it is labelled stuff fragment, because acknowledging it as a sex toy would apparently cause the foundation to collapse. You peek inside another archive, this one in Paris. A small room in the Louvre's administrative wing holds a collection of Roman and Etruscan domestic objects that includes a surprisingly large number of what any reasonable person would describe as ancient vibrators. Some are hollow bronze cylinders designed to hold warm oil. Others are made from glass, blown into phallic shapes with ridged sides and hollow centres. Early prototypes of internal warming devices, or extremely enthusiastic drink stirrers. Even the Vatican has its own dirty drawer. Deep within the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, there exists a sub-collection known unofficially as the Index Librorum Lubricos, a set of medieval and early modern illustrations too erotic for public view. Among them, sketches of marital devices used by monks and noblewomen, drawn in elaborate, almost devotional detail. A few are accompanied by Latin notes like instrumentum pactis, tool of peace. No one's fooling anyone. Fringe scholars have had a field day here. Some argue that museum suppression of these items isn't about prudishness, it's about control. The idea that ancient people were sexually sophisticated, that they not only understood but celebrated physical pleasure with crafted objects, threatens too many tidy historical narratives. It complicates the notion of civilization as something that evolves from savage indulgence to modern restraint, and so the evidence gets boxed up, relabelled, and quietly forgotten. In Berlin's Museum für Vor- und Frühgeschichte, a phallic object found in Hohle Fels cave, the one you saw way back in the Paleolithic section, is displayed under the title Symbolic Object. Its description avoids any sexual terminology, despite the fact that it is literally a 20,000-year-old carved penis. The scholarly debates swirl around it. Fertility symbol, status icon, ritual baton. No one says the obvious. It's a dildo, people, just say it. Meanwhile, private collectors hold the keys to entire categories of erotic history that never make it to public view. One well-known antiquities dealer in New York reportedly has a collection of over 70 ancient insertable tools, many from Egypt and India, stored in a climate-controlled vault. Each is tagged, dated, and, most intriguingly, photographed in use. Not by him, thankfully, but via ancient illustrations and context diagrams showing how the objects were originally used. These photos don't make it into gallery walls, they are considered unacademic, which is just a fancy way of saying too real. And sometimes it's not just the object that's hidden, it's the story. A Greek vase in the Met's collection shows two women reclining, one with an object between her fingers. The museum description? Women preparing for bathing ritual. Sure, if your bathing ritual includes a wooden insertable painted in the same red figure detail as their robes. You sit now in a museum back room, surrounded by drawers that never open for the public. You slide one open. Inside, dozens of carved objects, wood, stone, bronze, ivory. Some are plain, some ornate. One even has what looks like tiny eyes carved near the base, as if the artisan gave it a face to watch you with. It's funny, it's a little creepy. It's utterly human. These aren't relics of perversion or novelty, they're testaments. Proof that across centuries, continents and cultures, humans not only sought pleasure, they designed for it. They cared about materials, about shape, about warmth. They made art you could feel. Art that moved, art that buzzed. And museums, for all their glimmering cases and marble floors, still struggle to say what those objects are. But you know, you've seen them, you've held them in memory, in story. You've heard them rattling behind the glass. What we hide reveals more than what we show. The trail winds to its last stop, not in a library or a cave, or a locked museum drawer, but in a quiet, undecorated room. One you could be in now. There's a bedside table, a dim lamp, maybe a candle burning low, a phone charging nearby. On the nightstand, something smooth, curved, quiet when off, and alive with vibration when turned on. You know exactly what it is, no euphemism needed. Because now, for perhaps the first time in thousands of years, the history of sex toys is out in the open. Not hidden, not coded, not denied. It's part of the conversation. Products with instruction manuals, warranties and 5-star reviews. But how did we get from buried marble dildos and clunky medical vibrators to this brave new world of pleasure on demand wrapped itself in pastel silicone and minimalism? It started with openness, real openness. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the cultural tide shifted. Women-led companies like Good Vibrations and Babyland, formerly Toys in Babyland, began selling sex toys in boutique-like stores, ditching the dim lighting and trenchcoat energy of old-school adult shops. These spaces were bright, welcoming and focused on education, normalizing pleasure as a part of health and identity. The design of the toys shifted too, less realistic, more ergonomic, often intentionally abstract. A sex toy could now look like modern art, something you wouldn't be embarrassed to leave on the nightstand if your mum came to visit. Enter brands like Lilo, WeVibe and Dame, who began marketing their products like high-end tech gadgets, USB rechargeable, waterproof, whisper quiet, some even sync to apps, allowing long-distance partners to control them remotely. Your ancestors carved driftwood and used animal grease. Now you can buzz in time with a Spotify playlist or a synced video call. Imagine trying to explain that to a Viking seeress or a Japanese nun with a camphor wood relic. But even now, in the era of choice and customization, the story isn't just about what we have. It's about what was left behind, what people made when no one would talk about it, what they carved in secret, passed from hand to hand, smuggled between countries, buried with them in graves. Because what they left behind wasn't just physical, it was cultural, emotional, human. Let's go back, so just for a moment, and look at the thread that binds them all. That Paleolithic stone dildo from Hohle Fels cave. It shows signs of polishing, wear from regular handling. Its maker didn't carve it by accident. They chose the stone, smoothed it with care, passed it to someone who wanted it enough to keep it, maybe even hide it. The obsidian tool found in a Mayan ritual cave, sharp-edged but lovingly etched. Someone used it as part of a ceremony, for fertility perhaps, or for intimacy. The secret compartment in the Ottoman bathhouse chest, tucked in beside oil and poetry, never catalogued but never thrown away. It meant something to someone, and today there are thousands of artifacts still buried in private drawers, family heirlooms never discussed, or modern tools reimagined from old traditions. Some people still use jade eggs, modelled after Chinese Taoist practices. Some still prefer wooden tools, handmade and smooth, like their ancestors before them. Even with all our tech, we haven't outgrown the basics: shape, texture, warmth, intention. And the debates persist. Scholars still argue over whether the Venus figurines were erotic, spiritual, or both. Whether a Roman woman used her olisbos alone or with a lover. Whether monastic tools were for healing or quiet rebellion. The truth, it's probably all of it, because pleasure was never just one thing. It was ritual, it was resistance, it was invention, it was survival. In many cultures, pleasure was medicine. In others, it was heresy. In some, it was simply life, unashamed and accepted. The oldest truths are often the most inconvenient, and perhaps the most powerful. You sit now in a quiet room, the lights are low, a soft breeze pushes the curtain just slightly. On the table beside you, something carved, or moulded, or charged. Maybe it's your first, maybe it's your 10th, maybe it was a gift, maybe you made it yourself. You run your fingers along its edge, and it hums to life in your hand, steady and sure. And in that moment you hold not just a product, not just a toy, but the weight of thousands of years of invention, of silence, of laughter, of moments stolen in caves and temples and cloisters and bedrooms, a lineage of desire, a legacy of touch. The truth about ancient sex toys isn't that they were shocking. The truth is that they were everywhere, across every continent, every belief system, every era. They weren't marginal. They were central, testaments to creativity, to resilience, to the insistence that pleasure matters. So what they left behind wasn't shame or scandal, it was a signal that no matter the age, the politics, the religion, or the rules, someone, somewhere, was making something that felt good, and they left it for us to remember. So now, here we are, at the edge of the timeline, toes curling over into the now. You've traced this strange and sensual thread from Paleolithic caves to Bluetooth-enabled bedside tables, from marble columns to mid-century motorized gadgets, from the margins of sacred texts to the top drawers of millions of modern bedrooms. And maybe, if you've made it all the way through, you're realizing something. This wasn't a hidden history. It was simply a quiet one, whispered, passed hand to hand, preserved not just in carved wood or polished stone, but in memory, in metaphor, in muscle memory and myth. The truth about ancient sex toys is that they were never really lost. We just weren't always ready to see them for what they were. We labelled them ceremonial, symbolic. We filed them under fertility, or art, or mystery. But deep down, most people knew. And now, we're finally starting to say it out loud, with curiosity, with humour, with awe. Sex toys have always existed, not as indulgences, but as tools of freedom. They were how people survived the dark nights. The long marriages, the forced silences, the locked doors. They were how bodies remembered joy when the world tried to forget it. They were how people healed, how they rebelled, how they laughed when no one else was listening. They weren't deviant, they weren't shameful. They were human. So maybe tonight, as you roll over in bed and listen to the soft whir of your fan, or something else, you'll remember the nun with her carved camphor stick, the Egyptian girl hiding polished ivory beneath her necklace box, the Ottoman bath attendant warming a stone tool in rosewater, The Victorian lady winding her clockwork stimulateur before anyone knew the word vibrator. They were all part of this story. And so are you, sleep easy friend. You're part of a legacy older than writing, older than kingdoms, older than almost anything else we've ever made. The need to feel, to touch, to know ourselves and each other, that was never invented. It was just always there.